Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting in 2025 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. Our first item is an evidence session with the Scottish Fiscal Commission on their June and August 2025 publications. I'd like to welcome to the meeting Professor Graham Roy, Chair, Professor Francis Breeden, Commissioner, Professor David Ilfe, Commissioner, and Claire Murdoch, Head of Fiscal Sustainability and Public Funding. I have to say that entire swathes of the Amazon had to be devastated in order to produce these documents for old lags like me who have to rely on paper. So I will probably drown in it from time to time. But anyway, you have an opening statement, so please fire away, Professor Roy.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, and thanks very much for inviting us to speak with you today. Last week we published 2 reports, including our latest fiscal update, which summarised how recent developments in the economic and fiscal outlook have affected the Scottish budget this year and how they may affect the upcoming budget and spending review. Following your recommendation, we intend to make our late August update a regular feature of our annual publications. Looking back to June, the Scottish Government's medium-term financial strategy set out the scale of the challenge the Government faces in balancing its budget. Based on current trends, the Government expect spending to exceed available funding for day-to-day spending by £2.6 billion by 29/30 and for capital spending by £2.1 billion. This is equal to 4% of planned day-to-day spending and 23% of capital spending. Just as importantly, the Scottish budget also faces long-term pressures beyond the 5 years covered by the MTFS, as we've highlighted in our work on fiscal sustainability. Our fiscal update sets out some developments over the summer. Since June, the UK Government has made some policy changes which may affect future Scottish budgets. UK welfare policy has changed over the summer. Previously planned measures to restrict eligibility for PIP were removed from the legislation passed by the Parliament in July. The latest Social Security BGA forecasts were based on these policies being implemented. This was estimated to reduce the Scottish Government's funding by £0.4 billion by 29/30. This reduction will likely be reversed when the OBR produces its next forecasts, thereby increasing funding the Scottish Government receives for Social Security. An additional commitment has been made to allocate 5% of GDP to defence spending by 2035. The effect on the Scottish Government's funding position will be determined by how this is funded by the UK Government. Income tax outturn data for 23/24 was published in July, showing strong growth in Scottish income tax revenues, faster than in the rest of the UK. This growth contributed to a positive fiscal final income tax reconciliation of £406 million to be applied in the next Scottish budget. Our latest forecasts, and those of the OBR, do suggest, however, negative reconciliations applying to the next couple of future budgets. We now have pay deals agreed for most of the public sector workforce for the year, and most deals agreed also cover next year. We note that the pay deals agreed so far have exceeded the Scottish Government's public sector pay policy. As you know, the Scottish Government has committed to publishing a spending review alongside the budget. This will determine the trajectory of public spending over the next parliamentary term. The spending review provides an important opportunity for the Scottish Government and Parliament to address both immediate budget pressures and, crucially, long-term fiscal sustainability challenges. In June, the Scottish Government identified broad areas of efficiency and reforms in the public sector, which it plans to use to help close the fiscal gap. Except for its commitment to reduce the size of the workforce, however, the detail of how these efficiencies and reforms would be achieved has not been included. The spending review provides an opportunity to set out in detail how the Scottish Government will deliver the budget-saving measures presented in June. Finally, crucially, the process of a spending review is as important as the numbers themselves, and it will be crucial for the Government to set out their specific measures and targets for the public sector workforce, as well as public sector reform, how their spending plans will deliver key policies in areas such as climate change and child poverty, what their plans are for areas of spending which will be scaled back, and what are their long-term plans for infrastructure investment. And we'll be happy to answer questions on our reports.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, there's actually a huge area of potential questions, and some of them I'll probably leave for the Cabinet Secretary who will follow on from this. But just to start off, one of the things you talked about was achieving a reduction in the workforce, and you've said that this will require a significant departure from recent trends. Now, I understand that since 2019, the public sector workforce in Scotland has increased by 47,100, around 20,000 of whom are actually in health and social care. So how do you feel that can be done? The Scottish Government is talking about 0.5% a year, which doesn't sound much, but it's, you know, amounts to about 12,000 people overall.
So okay, I'll maybe make some general comments and then invite Francis and David will probably want to chip in as well. And so I guess the first point is essentially waiting to see the detail about how those targets for workforce reductions will be implemented. So where will the focus be? So the government have talked, for example, around protecting frontline services. So there's obviously questions about what do we mean by frontline services versus other services. Also, as well, there's, I think, a real question about what areas of the public sector any scaling back of public sector employment will be targeted. So you're right, we've seen significant growth in the devolved public sector workforce over the last few years, up to over about 250,000 is the total figure for the Scottish devolved workforce. But 160,000 of that is the NHS. So clearly, if you're choosing, for example, to prioritise the NHS and you're not going to have scaling back workforce there, that then means you need to find that 0.5% every year, so up to 12,000 jobs over the period that the government are talking about from a much smaller proportion of the overall budget. And that then does mean, you know, quite difficult choices about what you prioritise and how you structure your devolved public sector services to deal with what will be a significantly smaller workforce.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, one of the things that you've talked about in your update quite extensively is forecasting and issues such as forecasting error. I mean, so when we look at unemployment, for example, and employment, the Scottish Fiscal Commission has proven itself to be more accurate than the OBR, and you've said that's because your measure is based on real-time information data, and we know there's issues with the labour force survey. And you went on to talk about how, for example, you're developing a joint approach with the University of Strathclyde to develop a new regional model for short-term forecasting. So I just wonder if you can talk to us a wee bit more about that.
Okay, again, if I can maybe just go quite quickly into it. So we use, for our employment forecast and earnings, we use the RTI data, which we based on the HMRC, and it's high quality data, but it's always imperfect, so there's always likely to be an error in there. Ideally, the main economic survey that we would use for employment and earnings and everything on the labour market is the labour force survey, and we might come on to this. There's been some real challenges in the labour force survey around response rates and how accurate that is. So fortunately, we don't use that specifically in our forecast for income tax revenues, but it does have implications for us more broadly in terms of our overall economic forecasts and, crucially, our understanding of some of the economic fundamentals, and we might go into that. On the work that you're talking about around the new modelling that we're doing, that colleagues at the University of Strathclyde are working on, that is essentially a model that tries to be much more efficient at providing really up-to-date data and tracking about how the economy is doing. So moving into the world of what's called nowcasting and being able to give us much more sophisticated modelling measures that can let us track how the economy is doing in the near term. And that's work that they are doing as part of their own research, but we'll be looking to see if we can use that and incorporate that into some of our technical aspects.
I think it's worth adding on the. I mean, we moved to the RTI in a sense because we had to, because I mean, the problems with the LFS are bad enough for the UK, but obviously when you take them down just to Scotland, the data was really, for a long time, has been hard for us to use, and so that's. I think the OBR, you know, it was easier for them to continue using that, as we moved over to the RTI much earlier, and it's proved to be actually, you know, it's worked very well in terms of forecasting, but it does obviously open some really important questions about. We know very little about economic inactivity. You know, lots of data that and unemployment even we know we're rather uncertain about. But RTI has been really helpful for employment and earnings, and has helped us.
One implication of that is when we're talking about the quality of our forecasts about employment and comparing those to the OBR, you're comparing our forecast based on RTI data against outturns coming from that, vis-a-vis the OBR coming from labour force survey data compared to outturns coming from that. So you're really not comparing like with like there, which just creates a challenge of understanding how well we are performing in terms of forecasting.
Okay, I mean, one of the areas, of course, of concern to the committee has been the exponential, it seems, growth in the welfare budget. However, compared to your December 2023 forecast, outturns are provisional outturns 142 million less, about 2% less than predicted. Now, the majority of that has to be said, 151 million is issues relating to pension, age, winter heating payment. But most of the forecasts are 2 or 3% here or there. But one area where there's a significant difference is the child disability payment. So the forecast was 450 million and it's come in at 514 million. Which is a 14% differential. And the other one is the Scottish Welfare Fund, which has come in at 53 million as opposed to a forecast of 36 million, so it's a 49% differential. Now, you've explained the reasons for that in the paragraphs 4.26 and 4.18, but I'm just wondering if you can talk us through it just for the record.
Yeah. So essentially when we do our evaluation of our forecasts and then talk about the error that can emerge, the error can emerge for several different reasons. It can emerge because we got our judgments wrong. It can because of modelling mistakes, human error, wrong judgments. But it can also emerge because when we maybe made our forecast, policy has changed subsequently since then. And that's on things like you see the pension age winter heating payment. The government changed the policy between budget and then the financial year, so that then means that the forecast we made is then different from the outturn. And similarly, there's been some changes in the Scottish Welfare Fund where the government added more money into that, which then has an impact. The ones which I think are really interesting, because they get into the broader questions about where social security is heading, but also some of the broader issues about some of the challenges that we're seeing more broadly in the economy and society are things around like the child disability payment and the adult disability payment. So what we've seen, and one of the things that has surprised us is the higher caseload, particularly on child disability payment. So that's higher than our forecast. And that's leading to more payments in there. So I think when we were looking at for 24-25, we were looking at inflows of about 11,000, and actually inflows were closer to 16,000. And I think that opens up some really interesting questions about essentially, we'll update our forecasts in there, but actually what's driving that increase? So is that the system working perhaps more effectively or drawing more people in to claim child disability payment? Or is it actually reflecting some broader challenges within society where we're seeing real challenges around mental health and reporting of disability on the increase? And we've got something similar happening on adult disability payment as well, where we're seeing inflows that are growing into that. And some of that comes back to the point I think Francis was making about some of the challenges in the LFS, is that we'd like to be able to see from the labour force survey, high quality data on things like ill health for adults, then being able to see if we can reflect that in some of our disability payments. And that's where weaknesses and things like the LFS give us problems for being able to close that loop.
I mean, I think, the numbers are quite stark when you're looking at the number of people in adult disability payment rising to over 700,000 in the next 5 years. Are people in Scotland really becoming that much more unhealthy?
I think it's worse. I think people in the world are becoming that much more unhealthy. I think this is a trend that we're seeing in certainly the rest of the UK and indeed in other countries. It is a pretty widespread trend. So clearly Scotland is at the forefront in some sense, but I think this is a global trend, or a global developed economy trend.
I think one of the issues, of course, which is going to cause difficulties is the reconciliation in terms of income tax. So we're talking about £406 million applied in next year's budget, which is a nice wee bonus for the Scottish Government. But we're then looking at a subsequent reconciliation of minus £851 million, and that, of course, exceeds the reserve. So I'm just wondering what impact do you feel that will have on the Scottish budget?
Yeah. So I'd say that the first reconciliation you're talking about there is essentially confirmed, and that will hit the budget for next year, and that will boost the revenues higher than it otherwise would have been. And what you're talking about, the bigger one, the 850 million, is still indicative at this stage, because it will depend upon what the updated forecasts that ourselves and the OBR will do towards the end of this year, and then we'll know the actual outturn next July. Essentially, what we're seeing that's driving the data is that we've uplifted our forecast ever so slightly since we made our forecast for 24-25 by about 500 million, but the OBR have uplifted their forecast even more for the UK. And as you know, you've got these two different elements that are moving here, our forecasts and the OBR, and it's essentially the difference between the two that gives you the net position, and therefore that drives the reconciliation. And part of that is essentially seeing, if you recall, we got a couple of years where we saw Scottish earnings growth outperforming the rest of the UK, where you had a bit of a turnaround in the North East. You had stronger growth in areas like financial services, and that was pushing up Scotland's tax base growth relative to the rest of the UK. The data we've got, and I guess this is still all emerging, is that kind of improvement is eased off to the extent that the most recent forecasts for earnings that are coming through actually have us pretty much like for like with the rest of the UK. And overall, the OBR are forecasting higher tax revenue growth for 24-25 than we are. And that's what drives the reconciliation. So it's the combination of our forecasts being revised up slightly, but the OBR forecast being revised up by even more. I said I should caution that this number will change, because we will see the updates coming through later in the year. And then clearly, you're right, if that number does come through at 850 million or that kind of magnitude of that, then that will exceed the government's borrowing powers they've got for managing these forecast errors. And yeah, that would then mean that you couldn't just borrow the full amount. You could borrow some of it, but you'll have to find savings actually in spending to compensate.
And I think the analysis we've done suggests, this is not completely out of this range number. This is the sort of numbers, with a much larger nominal budget over time. These are the sort of numbers that you can expect to see relatively regularly, and therefore this will be an issue that the government will have to deal with quite regularly. That where the reconciliation is bigger than the borrowing limit.
Now, the resource budget is set to grow about 0.8% a year over the next few years, and which is somewhat less, Scottish Minds will say, than 1.2% across the UK. But given that the welfare budget is set to grow by, to increase such that it will be 6% higher as a share of the Scottish budget, that means that there will be less for every other department. Would I be right in saying that, as things currently stand?
Yes. So sorry, any David?
Just to say that because social security spending is demand-led spending, there's nothing much you can do to control that. So basically, once you strip that off from the other areas of spending, that tells you what you have left to spend across health, education, and all the other areas of spending. So it's really important to keep an eye on what's happening to social security.
I think there's certainly ways to control it. It's just whether they're politically palatable or indeed desirable, I think is more the kind of issue. But what the implications are likely to be for non-protected areas of Scottish budget, for example, i.e. excluding health and social care.
Yeah. So I think when we published our update in June, when we looked at the total resource budget and then the total resource budget less social security, you see quite clearly the real terms growth rates, particularly into 26, 27 and 27, 28 are very low, potentially, depending on your inflation you use, tend to even slightly negative. Now, one caveat with that is all these things will be updated post UK government announcements over the summer. We've got a UK budget as well, so these numbers will move around slightly, but the key point is that if you've got an overall resource budget that's growing relatively slowly, and your social security budget is growing more quickly than that, and as David said, that has first call on funding, therefore it then means that everything else in your system is going to have to take the bigger strain. And that gets into, I guess, where the spending review is going to be absolutely crucial, because you've got big questions about public sector workforce, which is over half the budget. You've got big questions around how much goes into the NHS, which is a huge component of the budget. And I think in my opening remarks, I made the comment that it's really important that the spending review has a strategy not just for where money is going to be spent and increased, it's actually where you're going to, what's your strategy for managing areas where spending is going to be decreased or cut back or grow less quickly, because the numbers that you see at the moment, unless something dramatically changes, means that there are going to be areas over the next 5 years that will have to pick up the slack for growth in social security or priority areas like the NHS.
Of course, we're all assuming that productivity isn't going to somehow leap forward in the next few years, but if it did, that would certainly make a big difference. I mean, one of the things you've also talked about in your update is about the need for clear budget information to aid scrutiny, and the Scottish Government certainly taken some steps towards that, because of, no doubt, because of the relentless nagging from yourselves in this committee to do so. But I'm just wondering if you can talk us through what you feel has been done that's been positive in terms of transparency, and what further the government needs to do to make that even more so.
Yeah, so I mean, the first comment I make is I think there has been a lot done over the last few years to improve the level of information that's provided in budget documents and to be more transparent in that. And I guess you recall one of the big improvements last year was to make the presentation of the budget document on the kind of the change from the ABR, so that the kind of most recent published figures in terms of spending into what would happen next year. And if you recall, what used to happen was that it was always relative to the draft budget of the previous year, which could make any comparison really quite difficult, because so many different things had changed. I think the caveat or the problem that arose, you remember last year, is that we had the autumn budget revision, and then after the autumn budget revision you had significant Barnett consequentials coming through the UK budget, which then meant that when you were presenting the budget and looking to the autumn budget revision, you then had quite a disconnect between what you were thinking the growth in certain portfolios was going to be relative to the reality, because you already had these significant Barnett consequentials coming through. And we highlight, I think on page 8 of our report, where you can see the quite significant variations in actually what was reported at the time in comparison with the autumn budget revision and the reality of what happened when you got around to the spring budget revision. So health and social care was, talked of real terms growth of 3.4%, and reality was that it was growth of just 0.3% when you came round to the spring budget revision. So I think one of the things we've highlighted here is to say, well, look, actually, where there are instances of significant change between autumn budget revision and budget, it'd be really good if the government could set those out, so then you could have a much more meaningful comparison. And that's the first area we talk about potential improvement. The second one is one which I know has been a favourite of the committee, which is the in-year kind of budget transfers, where something is announced for a portfolio, but it appears somewhere else in the budget later on in the year. And that happens, and governments clearly need to respond flexibly, but there are some areas where consistently money is allocated into a budget and we always know it's going to be moved into another one. And I guess our recommendation is, well, can we just have it in the budget that it really matters in the first place?
In 5.11, particularly about social care in terms of that. So that's very helpful in terms of aligning with what the committee's view is on that particular issue. Now, another area is national insurance contributions. That's an area obviously of significant interest. I mean, what you've said is that the UK government provided some £339 million to help ameliorate the impact of national insurance contribution increases in the current financial year. You've said that the gap in terms of what the Scottish Government will have to pay to meet those is between £200 and £400 million. I don't know if you get any further detail on where it lies between that 200 and 400 million. And this 339 million that the government is, the UK government has put in, I take it that's Barnettised, so that will be part of the budget as we go forward?
Yeah, so my understanding is, so the 339 is the change that was eventually barneted off the changes in the spending in the Whitehall department. So that is now essentially in the budget. We don't yet know where it's been allocated, so that will come through in the autumn budget revision, where the government will set out that. And we'll know more detail about where that is gone, and then therefore where areas essentially have had to take up the slack of these additional national insurance contributions within their existing portfolio. So we'll see where money has been transferred, but we'll get that when the government provide the update on it.
Okay, thank you for that. And I should have said, in terms of adult disability payment, section 4.22 of the fiscal update, you've said that you forecast the caseload to rise from 529,000 in the current financial year to 703,000 in 2030-31. So in a mere 5 years, it's going to increase by 174,000, with the financial implication, that's about 30%, with the implication that will rise from £3.6 thousand million to £5.4 thousand million in old money. So that's a 50% increase in 5 years. So that's really something for the committee and the government, obviously, to take real cognizance of. The last thing I was going to mention to you before, or ask about before we move to colleagues around the table, is capital allocation. So, interestingly, the kind of forecast shortfall in resource and capital isn't that different. It's like $1 billion odd in the next financial year or so, rising over the next 5 years to about 2.1 billion compared to about 2.56 for resource. I wonder if you can tell us what the inflationary impact has been in capital over the last 5 years relative to the allocation. My understanding that the allocation over the last 5 years has declined while inflation has been about 27%. And if that's at the root of this gap.
Francis, do you want to maybe say a bit about inflation and capital? I'll explain a bit about the overall budget.
Yes, I guess the capital budget has been declining in real terms, but there was a big increase potentially from the recent budget. But as you know, a lot of that's gone because it's been now moved to reserved areas as part of the spending review, or not moved. It's been sort of allocated to the reserved area. So the Scottish capital budget is still gets a boost, but as you say, the decline over historically and in the future is a steady one, which it's a concern for capital in the sense that we all know that capital spending is, if we're worried about future productivity, a good capital budget is a big element of that, and therefore that reduction is a long-term concern.
And I think and if you look at what's happened to the capital budget, and this is again, I think, a thing about how you manage capital budgets. We had the huge increase in 25-26, relative to where we were in 24-25, which largely reversed the previous government's plan to kind of essentially freeze capital spending and let it drop by about 20%. So what we get is this huge boost in 25-26, but then it largely just kind of tails off. It just is largely flat in cash terms, and it starts to fall in real terms. I think there are genuine questions there about how effective does that let you kind of manage your capital profile, and what are the impacts it has on inflation. So it's not just, I think, how inflation impacts on the capital budget, but it's about how does capital impact on prices for various key activities. And I guess one of the challenges in having big lumpy injections of capital to be spent within relatively short periods of time, and you can put some in reserve, you can do things with ScotWind, etc., to try and smooth it out, is that you end up driving up prices in a lot of the investment you're trying to do. So the actual value for money becomes much less.
Yeah,
so
if you get the same workforce and you're just you're injecting cash, you're going to get an inflationary boost, and then when the capital starts to tail off, as it's going to do in the next 5 years, you can do less with it.
Yeah, now the government have got flexibility to try and smooth it, because you've got capital borrowing, so you could then ease off on your borrowing. Or you could then, there's then about prioritisation of ScotWind funding, which is now much more in capital than it has been than it's ever been, which is again a good thing, and also then what you can use in the reserve, etc. as well. I guess there's a basic question about, does it kind of make sense to have these lumpy injections of capital through the block grant?
One would have thought steady
having a
growth would have been
longer term?
better, actually, to allow capacity to increase. But it's about the impact of
Yes.
this in real
Yep.
people and real communities. We can talk about capital, but what it really means is that if we're considering that a huge chunk of that is actually routine maintenance, which people forget, people think capital is just spent on building things. It means there's less money for new projects. Is that right? Which will then have to be delayed.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so we don't look into the detail about what happens in terms of the spend, in terms of value for money, but, you know, in a basic point of principle, if you're having to spend, you know, very quickly, then that obviously naturally means that then, you know, there's less supply going around, which all else remaining equal will increase the price, so you get lower value for money. And I think that's where one of the really, I think, important things in the spending review will be a really clear plan from the government about what it plans to do about its capital priorities, but also the timing of these capital priorities and how they're all joined up, and what's the relative profile of that, and what their expectation is around value for money. And again, we don't have the plan yet. The government have obviously set out projections of a gap in capital, which suggests they have a plan in terms of what the priorities will be. But we'll need to get the detail of all of that when the spending review comes around.
And I think you make a good point about, you know, depreciation. I mean, it's natural. You know, the first thing you spend your money on is stopping bridges falling down and, you know, and roads crumbling. So the real growth producing investment is a bit on top of that. And therefore, if you do cut the capital budget too much, you end up, you know, in a really negative spiral where the economy is constrained by lack of public infrastructure, growth slows, tax revenue slows, you spend less money on capital, you know, the whole thing gets into a very difficult downward spiral. So I think it is worth noting that even though the capital budget seems large, you know, as you say, a lot of it is really just maintaining the capital stock you already have.
Yeah, you can end up in a vicious circle rather than a virtuous circle.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to open up the session now to colleagues around the table. The first to ask questions will be Liz, to be followed by John.
Thank you. May I focus on the revenue side of the budget? And you said earlier, Professor Roy, that obviously most of the data that you require to estimate revenues comes from HMRC and the RTI. But when we are looking for fiscal sustainability quite into the long term, we need more data than that, particularly about the labour market. And you said that you have concerns about the fact there's a lot of missing data from that labour market. Could you tell us a little bit more about your concerns on that basis? Because these trends really matter for the future, the number of people who will be in work as opposed to those who are out of work, whether that's through unemployment or inactivity. And therefore the projections for ensuring that we do have fiscal sustainability are really very dependent upon some of that data which we don't appear to have. Could you say a bit more about that?
I can go first, and then I'm sure David, you might want to come in as well. But I mean, the general point I think is you're right. I think we depend upon data, and policy making depends on really good data and statistics around that. And the labour force survey, why it's so useful is that it gives really rich data on employment, but types of employment, so part-time, full-time, self-employed. It gives data on employment by gender, by region, by by age, and it does the same thing with things like unemployment as well. And then crucially, as Francis said, it gives you really rich data on inactivity. So what are the ages of people who are inactive? Why are they inactive? So in some ways, you could be inactive at a young age if you're in full-time education. So we don't have to worry about that. But if you're inactive because you're of working age, but you're off for ill health, well, that's a real concern. Yep. So we really need that really richness of the data to be able to understand, what are the big drivers of this? So is this spike in adult disability, is it caused by something that's happening in the labour market or the economy? What other data can we use to see that? And the problem at the moment is that the data is just not fit for purpose. It's not, we can't trust it. There's always margins for error, there's always errors in there, but when it becomes something where we genuinely don't really believe it, then that means we're kind of flying blind to an extent.
Can I just dig a little bit deeper as to why that data isn't there? Because it's absolutely critical, obviously, for longer term planning. I mean,
one of the key reasons is the drop in response rates. So the labour force survey is is a survey where it essentially asks people about their current employment conditions and what's happening. And across all kind of major economies, particularly post-COVID, is that the response rates for these surveys has really fallen quite significantly. In the olden days, you would just go and speak to people, you would phone them up, you would see them in the street, you would find different ways of doing it. But now, because people are working from home, they don't have the same access to traditional communications and things like that. And I guess trust in statistics as well has been more challenging, is that you've just seen a real drop in the response rate. And therefore, if you have a real drop in the response rate, particularly amongst kind of, maybe groups that you are particularly wanting to understand in detail, so maybe, people who are inactive for ill health, or different ethnic minorities, or genders, or age, or things like that, you really need to be really oversample and really, dig into the detail there. And that's become really challenging, and the Office for National Statistics has really struggled to essentially keep up, and that's why the surveys become really, really poor at giving results.
We're in a sort of funny period of statistics because administrative data, the quality and the amount of it has increased hugely. I mean, the RTI is a great example of a data set where it's not a survey, it's collected from actual administrative information. It's been a really useful addition. So we have this sort of situation of statistics where the administrative data is getting much better, but generally speaking, the survey data, for whatever reason, is getting worse. And clearly, there's some things you still have to survey, and things like inactivity is part of it.
Does that then include the fact that within these vague sort of trends that we have, does it mean that it's very difficult indeed to predict where policies to try to reduce the amount of economic inactivity is really pretty hard to get that right? Is that one of the major problems?
Yeah. Yes. And David, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I think it's also a question of where the activity is taking place. So one thing you need to understand somewhat better is what's happening with young people entering the labour force and their propensity to be attracted down to the southeast of London and that area, rather than staying in Scotland and working in Scotland. So we need to understand those mobility issues as well, and where the people are actually moving to take up work.
Do we have any optimism about how we're going to get this data? Because I just feel that it's such a crucial problem in terms of policy making, and particularly for longer term sustainability, because you're not going to achieve that longer term sustainability unless you're able to increase the revenues that are coming into the economy. And if we don't know where that revenue might come from, it's a pretty serious problem. Do we have any optimistic outlook as to what we're going to...
I mean, there's a couple of things. So as Francis said, the shift towards administrative data becomes is potentially one avenue for that. So the richness in the tax data, the richness in data from Social Security Scotland, for example, in terms of things like disability payments and what's driving that, what are the characteristics, that helps. But ultimately, I think a lot of it will come down is rethinking how you do these big labour force surveys and investing in capability and resources and digital capabilities and resources that let you do it in a much more in a much more sophisticated way. So, can you maybe boost the sample overall by having a larger number of people filling it in digitally? There are concerns about that. It might not be as accurate, but actually, if you have a bigger sample, does that wipe out some of the accuracy concerns that you have? So ONS have been working on this for a couple of years now. You probably saw the evidence session at the parliamentary committee where this was discussed. They have been working on this for a while, but it doesn't seem yet that we have got the progress that is needed. So it's, well, what more can we do to actually get it happen? And just your point is right. This is fundamental for policy. If you want to have something to improve employability, you'd want to be able to see what happens to employability. And if you don't have that, then it's a real problem.
Yeah, so it just means there's a bit of a vacuum just now where people are trying to do the right thing, but they don't really know if it's going to be accurate because they don't have the necessary data to...
Yeah, and I think that the two concerns I have about it, one is you're right, there's a real concern about actually making good policy, but it also erodes the trust that people have in evidence and statistics to inform policy, because if you don't have the evidence or statistics to inform policy, then actually why do you bother having evidence and statistics in the first place? And I think that is an even more worrying potential trend.
Okay, thank you.
John, to be followed by Craig.
Thanks, Convener. Convener touched on quite a number of issues, so I'll maybe go back to one or two of them, and particularly this £851 million potential negative reconciliation in 27-28. Now, I accept it's uncertain. In the past, we've had kind of bad news warned about, and then things have improved. So, does that mean I can be relaxed about this figure? And if not, what is the government going to have to do? If that is 851, do we kind of do nothing this year, but then when we come to the 27-28 budget, there'd have to be a real reduction?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So I would never be relaxed about anything with the fiscal framework. So, so just to explain, so what we're seeing is essentially the reconciliations is largely ends up being the difference between our forecast error and the forecast error in the BGA. And what we've seen, or at least what we've dated, is that if you compare our budget setting forecast versus the latest forecast we did in May, we've uplifted our forecast for Scottish income tax by about 150 million. That's the difference there. If you look at the BGA, so that's the forecast from the OBR around equivalent tax growth in the SUK, that's gone up from about 17.4 billion to about 18.4 billion. So that's gone up by $1 billion there. So it's the movement of these two different elements, our forecasts and the OBR forecasts. And part of that is because the trends we've seen in earnings. So we've seen earnings in Scotland outperform the rest of the UK in recent times, but actually the most recent data we've got, and we talk about it in our fiscal update, is that gap is narrowed, and actually potentially UK earnings, if anything, are actually have been growing slightly faster than have in Scotland. And all those different elements then mean that you have, on current trends, this negative reconciliation coming down the line. As I said, there's a much the much more important, I think, update will be in December when we've got updated OBR figures on another set of RTI data and our updated figures as well, which will have more up-to-date earnings data and RTI data and evidence. And that's a crucial one, because that then is the one which will set the budget for next year. And then the government can then start to do things like, thinking about, well, how much potentially will they need to borrow for this? And if it does exceed borrowing, what adjustments might they want to do to potentially maybe smooth some of the growth into next year's budget for when this hits in the subsequent year?
And the borrowing limit for that purpose is 700
just
million?
over 600 million. Yeah,
just
700 million.
600.
It's forecast to be 666 million because it now increases with
inflation.
So they're close to,
Yes.
Yeah. And it's also worth saying, I mean, the one thing you could do is try and add more to the reserve this year to be ready for this. But it might become a similar issue with the reserve. The limit on the total size of the reserve has become a binding constraint as well. So there is rather limited room to adjust to these big numbers.
Yes. So I was going to... Sorry.
The other thing to add is that although we don't know the precise number, I think it's highly unlikely that it will go from being negative to positive.
Positive, yes.
So you can certainly think of it would be a negative reconciliation. And then the question is, how are you going to manage that reconciliation? But it could be a higher number as well.
Because if it comes down, that's good, but if it goes up, that's a problem. So that kind of leads me on, Professor Breeden, to yourself, because I think you said these kind of larger negative or positive reconciliations could become more likely.
Yeah.
And I was reading in, is it page 25, 3.22, about is it 24% chance of a negative reconciliation exceeding 600 million? Can you just explain that to me a little bit? I mean, is that just a kind of random kind of statistical thing, or is that...
Yeah, so that calculation is a random statistical thing, yes. Well, we just calculated the sort of forecast errors that both we and the OBR can make, how correlated our mistakes are, and that gives you a potential range for reconciliation. So that's a statistical exercise just to give you and ourselves a feel. But I think the underlying message is, the limit on borrowing is smaller than the range of reconciliations we're likely to see, and as I said also, potential the same. The way the reserve could help is also now being limited by the fact that the reserve very often hits its top limit as well. So it does mean that with in-year adjustments to these events are going to happen, which is maybe not the best way to run a budget, but that's the bottom line.
Let's just say that there's two factors driving the size of that figure of 24% probability. One is the overall level of tax revenues. And we're now at such a high level of tax revenue that errors matter quite a lot more in terms of hitting that target of 600 million. But the other issue is what's the correlation between our errors and the OBR errors. Initially, when we did this exercise in 2021, we assumed that correlation was about 50%. The data suggests it's actually a lot higher than that. It's like 80%. And that's the figure we use to get this figure of 24% probability. Right. But if that correlation was to drop, say, to 40%, then you get a 1 in 3 chance of exceeding the limit. So that correlation matters quite a lot. If we in the OBR make exactly the same mistake, there's no reconciliation. Yes. It's only because we make different mistakes that you have this probable reconciliation. So that's why the correlation between what we're doing and what the OBR are doing matters quite a lot.
Okay, I think my statistics are struggling at this point to get all these percentages, but I get the general kind of point. I mean, I know you can't go into the political side, but I mean, just from a technical side, as was suggested by I think all of you, if things are becoming more volatile, or at least we've got more risk because now Scotland has more responsibility for a whole range of things, is there a technical argument that 600 million or the 700 million reserve should be increased without going into the political space?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where any constant reviewing of the fiscal framework to see how it's operating and working, I think entirely makes sense, because I think the idea about the borrowing was to basically give the government flexibility to manage forecast error from the Scottish Fiscal Commission and the OBR, and I don't think it was ever designed to be a kind of this is a limit and that's it, and anything else you have to suck up. It was about the fact that we've got these forecast errors that are there. And I do think, there's a really interesting number, the 600 million, which is now growing by inflation. But if you look at where revenues are in total, in 2021, income tax revenues were 12 billion, now 20 billion. So there's a question about, well, that huge growth in nominal income tax revenues just means that even, the slightest error is going to matter much more on revenues of 20 billion than it does on 12 billion. So there's a question there about. And
we've got like social security is just a much more volatile thing.
Now that's slightly easier to do because obviously you can have the adjustments within year, and the forecast error on social security should, touch wood, be smaller than it is with the income tax revenues, because it's more about administrative data and just you don't have the same volatility in things like people applying for adult disability, etc., than you would do for the income tax forecast.
But we have found it difficult to forecast exactly the social security. Is that just because it's new and it will calm down? It'll be easier to forecast in the future?
Yeah. So, in time, once you have it bedded in, then it'll be influenced much more by demographic trends, much more by long-term trends in health and disability. So it's likely, all else being equal, to be much more stable as a forecast. There'll still be errors, there'll still be changes in policy, but it's not likely to bounce around as much as potentially income tax would be. Income tax, you're relying on purely on the judgments about overall economy. Is impacted by what happens on things like tariffs and things that are completely outside the government's control. So it's likely to be much more volatile and a much more subjective judgment. I think
it's also, there's just the sort of technical point, which is the gap between us making a forecast for income tax and the actual outturn of the data is sort of 2 years effectively. So there's this big gap between, whilst with Social Security, we know that we get the outturns way quicker. Yes. So that makes the whole reconciliation process much easier. So it's this big gap, which is mainly related to self-assessment, which comes very late, that means that forecasting income tax is particularly, the errors can be particularly important for reconciliations.
Thanks. The other, right, okay.
So you might want to ask is, should we be uplifting the borrowing limit, not just in line with inflation, but should we scale it to something else? there might be an issue the committee might want to.
Yes, I think I'm going to ask that to the Cabinet Secretary when she comes in, so that's been very helpful. Thank you.
I'm sorry, just because we're fiscally prudent, the limit on the reserve is equally important as the limit on the
yes,
borrowing.
both. Yes, absolutely. The other area I want to touch on was the whole area of pay policy, and this. So the idea was, as I understand it, 9% over 3 years, 3% each year, but a number of settlements have already been made, I think total 8% for the first 2 years, which only leaves 1% for the third year. And I think there's a figure of 122 million has been mentioned. I don't know if that was yours or the government's, as the kind of difference here. So where is that leading us? Because that the plan was 0.5% reduction in the public sector workforce each year. So is that going to need to be bigger now to match that 9%?
Yeah. So again, these are all government calculations out, the 0.5% and things like that. And I think when the government were making that, some of the pay awards that had already been agreed that were above the 3% were actually in the MTFS. So you would argue, you'd hope that was all be that loop would be closed on that. But the basic point, I think, is that with a relatively fixed budget growing the fixed budget growing relatively slowly, and pay over half of the budget, if you're putting more money into pay that is above pay awards, then either you have to find that money from cutting back the public sector workforce by more than you had planned, or by essentially saving in day-to-day costs of public service delivery. So, I mean, it's largely simply arithmetic in that context, because the government is constrained in its overall budget envelope.
And I mean, clearly the public sector workforce has been growing in recent years. So I think you make the point it would be quite a change for it to be reduced. And am I right in saying that there's no detail so far as to where that reduction would be? It just appears to be, from what the government's saying, it's 0.5% across the board.
Yes.
But maybe something about frontline services.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And that's where I think it gets into the questions about, well, what is a frontline service? What's not? How do frontline services depend upon back office functions? But also, as well, as I mentioned, the big ticket items. So there's about 250,000 people employed in the devolved public sector in Scotland, 160 of them in the NHS. So if you're, where's the relative balance in there? Because if you're finding 12,000 or 15,000 from the remainder, then that is a much more significant adjustment in your kind of non-health public sector workforce. Or are you going to try and find some things in the NHS too?
The other point to add is that the expectation is they can meet that 0.5% reduction through natural wastage, people retiring, not being replaced, etc., rather than by redundancies. If you can't meet some of these targets, you may have to reach more into redundancy as a way of balancing the workforce.
And if there's redundancies, that usually means there's a lump sum to be paid to people. Yep. Is that taken into account in all of these figures?
Yeah, I mean, my assumption will be that typically appear in just the costs within the portfolio. It's a bit like progression that will come in there. I mean, I think David makes a really good point about kind of natural progression. And again, I come back to the point about the spending review. I think the spending review is a really important point, not just to set out the numbers, but to set out what is your plan for the shape of the public sector workforce going there. Because if you're purely relying on natural progression, that is largely just kind of distributed randomly across the public sector without any real strategy for how you're actually going to manage the public services in there. And I think that's where, again, the spending review is really important, not just to set out the numbers, but to set out what is the pay, the pay policy, but also the broader public sector workforce strategy. Because,
I mean, I thought the public sector reform would, be looking at, well, this area, there's definitely too many workers, and maybe this area, in fact, there's slightly too few or something, and there would be some kind of targeting of that. Yeah. Because, I mean, if you take the fire service, they've been quite very successful at reducing the number of fires. So, there is an argument, I'm not saying I'm arguing it, but there's an argument for reducing the size of the fire service. But they don't seem to be looking at things that way, as far as I can see.
Yeah, but I guess that's where the spending review will be crucial to have done that work. But also, because you're right, because again, this gets right into things like public sector reform, efficiencies. So clearly, if you're saving workers in some areas, well, what does that then mean in terms of broader efficiencies? that are coming down the line.
And are you optimistic that the Scottish Spending Review is going to go into a lot more detail, or do we just not know if that's going to go into detail?
And it's obviously a question for the Cabinet Secretary in terms of the detail. I think we've been quite clear. I think that the Spending Review is a real pivotal moment. It's a real milestone moment, I think, in the public finances of not just this term of the Parliament, but in future terms. And as I said, I think for me, it's not just the numbers, but it's the process about how you actually do the spending review. You know, what's the exercise that you set departments? Is it zero-based budgeting? Is it scenario planning and different components? What's the workforce element that sits behind all of that? What are the detailed efficiency savings and how they're going to be tracked, monitored, evaluation? So the actual process of the spending review is actually arguably even more important than the first set of numbers that come out.
So I think, we, and I'm sure everybody in this room, when you just see efficiencies, that sets an alarm bell ringing, because it says, well, what are you talking about here? This is like wishful thinking. So I think we are really looking forward to seeing sort of detail of where those things come from, rather than just a sort of catch-all phrase. But as I say, it is very genuinely early in the process, and therefore you wouldn't expect those details yet. But I think we were all waiting with bated breath to see what those details are.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Incidentally, the full-time equivalent public sector workforce in Scotland is 469,100 according to the medium-term financial strategy. Okay, Craig, followed by Ross.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Quite a lot of the ground that I was intending to cover has been covered. So maybe just get a question for you, Professor Roy, in relation to the form, function and frequency of the various reports that this committee looks into. Obviously, the medium-term financial strategy was delayed. That was something that we were critical of. We now potentially have a spending review, which, if it was going to be warts and all and completely open and frank, you probably wouldn't want it on the eve of a Scottish parliamentary election. So from your vantage point, is there more that could be done in the next Parliament so that we streamline this process, declutter the number of reports and strategies, so that we actually get a much clearer impression as to where Scotland's public finances actually are?
If I could say a couple of things. So, I would probably push back, or at least there's a counter-argument about doing a spending review in advance of a parliamentary election, in the sense that I can understand that they're immediately going to get into politics, and there's questions about what sets out in there. But a spending review done well and setting out all the issues, I think, sets the scene for the debate about the priorities of the next government, whoever that is in the election. And it's a really important point, because it helps show where, if people are going to ask or demand increased spending in some areas, the spending review should be very clear about, well, then where do you have to find the money elsewhere? And that's a challenge not just to the government, but to any party wanting to form the next government. And also the exercise of a spending review, the process of a spending review, I think, provides a lot of the evidence base that then helps whoever comes into government post-May to have the sort of information that is needed to make the right decisions and the decisions that they want to do. So I think a spending review, abstracting from the politics, I think is really important to have, and actually in many ways it's advantageous since it's in a run-up to an election. The broader point then, I think, about the clarity of the process, the challenge we have to an extent is always that the Scottish budget process is heavily linked to the UK budget process. So as much as I think I agree with what you're saying, it'd be great to have real clarity and to really cut back and the movability of different elements of the budget. So we have a budget at the end of the year, and we have a medium-term financial strategy in the springtime. Just stick to that, that's great. There are caveats around that, and it does depend upon decisions at the UK level, which have particular issues. So the delay in the MTFS caused, or at least the argument from the government was that it was because of the UK spending review, so therefore that's why they delayed it. Sometimes we've seen the Scottish budget come right up to Christmas time because of the lateness of the UK budget. So I think in broad, both the Scottish and UK budget systems being much clearer and more fixed in terms of the timelines, I think would be a real advantage.
Okay. In terms of something you referred to in the fiscal update, you say that ending fiscal transfers would improve the scrutiny and functioning of the Scottish budget, as they have, and I quote, serious and material effects, particularly in health, education and local government. From the discussions you've had with the Scottish Government, why are they so reluctant to actually make what would seem like a relatively modest and sensible change to the way they present their accounts?
part of it, I think, is just it's always the way it's been done. So it's just the way that that's been presented. That again, I guess from the government's perspective about trying to be transparent about, well, this is the allocation we did last year, so we just wanting to compare it to where the allocation was the previous year and set it out. And then part, I think, it's because people like yourselves and the committee and others are actually saying, well, actually, that's not the best way to do it. We would like it in a more informed way, and this is why we could use it and engage with that. And I think the government has been moving on this. It's not perfect, and we'll keep on pushing it for more in there. I think the internal budget transfers is a good example of one where they've started to make steps. So they've done some things around the pay awards for social care, etc. That's been really quite helpful, and we just want them to kind of complete the task.
Yeah. Obviously, the kind of risks that the MTFS identify, we do hope the spending review will actually start to put down the mitigations in respect of that. We've talked about public sector pay this morning. Obviously, some of those major areas of public sector pay have already been set for potentially 2 years. They're at 7%. That leaves less than 2%. There's an inflation guarantee in there. It doesn't account for pay progress, and it also doesn't account for grade inflation, which I think we have seen within the civil service. Is that an alarm bell that I think you think is ringing quite loudly now in respect to the long-term sustainability of Scotland's public finances?
I think it's something, I come back to my point about the spending review. I think it's something that it would be incumbent and you would hope you would see within the spending review is a real strategy for how the public sector workforce and the pay bill in its entirety is going to be managed and set out over the medium term. And that isn't just, what is the broad pay policy, which is what we've had this year, which is an improvement on what we've had before, but a strategy around, exactly what's the total cost of the public sector pay bill. So progression, inflation, grade inflation, but then also what is what's the relative balance of decisions on pay relative to decisions about the workforce. And again, spending review is the ideal time to really set all of that out.
Yeah. Sorry.
I think in the MTFS, the government was quite good at setting out these additional elements like pay progression. Yeah. They were included in their calculations. So it wasn't just the pay award. There was pay progression added in as well.
Yeah. Presumably the risk is, though, if the government doesn't meet its 0.5% target, this is all compounding through the system eventually. They're going to have a larger civil service than they're projected and potentially higher pay than they have in their pay policy. That's the risk, isn't it?
Yeah, and with a fixed budget, that's always the challenge, is that you have the more you put into public sector pay, you have less elsewhere. I guess the caveat with all of that is ultimately public sector workers are the people who deliver the public services, so you've got to be it's all part of that conversation about where are you putting your resource to deliver the public services that you want. And back to David's point about just relying on natural kind of attrition in that way, that doesn't guarantee that you've actually got the right people in the right place if you just let it happen naturally.
Yeah. One of the other risks, obviously, is within devolved social security. I think, Professor Rolfe, when you were before us last time, you put two quite interesting and quite alarming statistics in that the relative refusal rate for adult disability payment was 16% in the rest of or in England, 2% in Scotland. When we put those numbers to the Scottish Government, they said that we weren't comparing apples and pears, and it was something to do with the fact that those benefits were recently devolved. Have you been able to interrogate that data any further to show whether or not it is a policy approach or whether or not it's something because of the recent devolution of those benefits?
I think we don't pursue that any further at this stage. But
I think clearly there is an issue because there's a lot of transfers of people who are on the UK coming to the Scottish system, and the extent to which they come off the benefits is going to be different from somebody who's been in the system altogether. But I think we have some relative confidence that this is an underlying trend in the system, and one of the reasons you can see that is because of the way that reviews are done. There is this idea that the reviews are almost, not entirely, but largely self-certified, whereas in the UK system that's less the case, and therefore you could reasonably expect that if you're self-certifying, you're much less likely to sign yourself off a benefit than if you had been reviewed elsewhere. So I think it's a fair point. I think that it will be a while until we get a completely solid take on the data, because the transfer process is still going on. But I think we're fairly confident that we'll find that's the case.
If the ambition is to get things right first time, you would expect a somewhat lower rate of people being refused under the Scottish system compared to the PIP system. So you have to again think about all the other elements that are going into the administration of Social Security as well. It's not just the review process, it's the whole process of getting people put on benefits in the first place.
Yeah, and just to be clear, and on the point about the data and what we're seeing, we're still seeing that same trend that Professor Alf was talking about. And yes, we've got a PIP system in England and Wales, we've got an ADP system in Scotland, so things are going to be things are always going to be slightly different, and also these things are bedding down. But the basic point that we are seeing far fewer people seeing their ADP decreased or ended relative to what you're seeing in England and Wales. That still holds. So I think we're tracking around about 3% still, seeing their payments decreased or ended, and that number is over 20% in England and Wales. So there's still a gap there. We'll need to wait time to see how that evolves over the course of the forecast period, but that gap is still there. And again, the government actually, I think they talked about that, I think in the MTFS, where they said, look, actually we're seeing this as well, and we need to think about whether this is working as perhaps as we intended.
Yeah. One of the other risks obviously relates to what happens in decisions taken by the UK government. Obviously, the MTFS, I think, refers to demographics domestically as one issue, but defence spending potentially could be something that could ride a coach and horses through. The UK budget would have a consequence here. Given the nature of the global economic and defence security position, you would get the impression that defence expenditure potentially is likely to rise rather than fall as a percentage of the UK budget. What risks, therefore, are there for devolved areas of expenditure if the UK government has to cut frontline public spending in the rest of the UK?
Yeah. So again, this starts to get straight into what's the overall UK position, and we know that the UK fiscal position is really challenging at the moment, and there's real difficult decisions that they're going to have to deal with in order to cope with things like the rising bond rates, etc. So there's that context, which then means that then any spending commitments that they then make have to be taken into that consideration. So clearly, if you put more into defence and the commitment to increase defence expenditure to 5% of GDP by 2035, I think that's right, 2035, that is a big spending commitment that is going to demand resources to go into that. What that then means for the Scottish budget depends about how that's funded. So if it's funded by borrowing and doesn't have an automatic impact on other public services, then there wouldn't be an immediate direct impact. If instead, though, the government say, well, actually, because of this overall challenging fiscal position, we're going to have to make savings in the planned growth in domestic public services to pay for defence, and these happen to be in areas that are devolved, then the future block grants will be less than it otherwise would have been because of that increased defence expenditure.
Yeah, and so far, the increase in the defence budget has come largely from the aid budget, so it's come from one reserve to another reserve, so it hasn't had an impact, although on the capital budget, it's already had a big impact on the Scottish capital budget because more UK capital spending is going into defence.
But is that sort of contingency that should be built into the spending review? The Scottish Government should be aware that this is a potential real risk to their own financial settlement.
Another thing is that there may be some macroeconomic effects of the defence spending.
I was going to ask
that boost spending in Scotland.
Yeah.
There could be more economic activity.
So that could potentially drive economic growth and employment in Scotland, as it has done recently.
Yeah.
No, super. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ross, to be followed by Michelle.
Thanks, Convener. The MTFS sets out 4 broad categories for spending. You've covered quite a bit already around public service reform and efficiency. The other 2 are around increasing the value, the impact of public spend and preventative spend, something that's been a perennial issue we've discussed with you before. I'm interested if I can ask a 2-part question on increasing the value of public spending and preventative spend. Looking back over the period of recent MTFSs, have you seen any trajectory of improvement in how the Scottish Government approaches maximising value for public money in its spending and preventive spending? And looking ahead, have you got any evidence that the Government has clear plans to improve its score on both of those counts?
So that's a really, really good question. I mean, I think the answer to the first bit is probably more a question for Audit Scotland rather than from us. So we wouldn't look at the kind of whether there's been better value coming through that. That typically be a question for Stephen Boyle and the team about who look back. We tend to look more at the kind of broader macro piece about coming to. I mean, it is an interesting one about maximising the value of public spending, putting a number on it, and how that differs. Back to Francie's point, how does that differ from efficiency savings? Yeah. And I think there's. It'd be good to understand what were the calculations that
there's no neat distinction between that and preventative spend either. Yeah, preventive spend is often the most impactful kind of spend.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of the challenge. And again, to answer your next bit about what comes next, I think being really clear about what's the definition of these different elements. So what is in the preventative spend bucket? What is in the kind of value for money bucket? What is in the efficiency saving bucket? What's the overall bit? But crucially, how are they going to be monitored and tracked over time? And again, that's why, for me, I think it's the process of the spending review that identifies all of these, sets out what they are, and sets clear paths to these outcomes is going to be the crucial bit.
Sorry, David.
The extent to which preventive spending requires a different type of workforce than the existing workforce or treating people, you may have to see an initial blip in employment to get the people into the preventive area. So that has the long-term effects of cutting the demand for people who need treatment.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, that goes back to, I'm almost reminiscent of John Mason's line of questioning around, do you take money out of hospitals to put it into areas like housing where you know you'll get a long-term health benefit, but nobody wants to defund hospitals at the moment. Other area that was interesting, it picks up somewhat on what Craig Hoy was just asking about in terms of impact to UK government decisions, but from the other side, not the spending side, but the tax side. The Treasury have been pretty continuously briefing over the last couple of weeks that they are looking at what could be really significant changes in the tax system for England, particularly in relation to stamp duty and council tax. One of the options that has been mooted, that's been briefed, is replacing both of them with a new combined tax. Obviously, the impact of any change on that scale for Scotland would be significant. What I'm interested in is whether the fiscal framework as it currently stands could cope with significant tax reform that affects England or the rest of the UK, but not Scotland, or would any change on that scale immediately necessitate reopening and reforming the framework itself?
I mean, I don't know, Claire, if you want to come in on this as well, from a technical point of view. I mean, I think I guess it really depends, as I guess is the kind of short answer. It really depends on the nature of the reform, and on things like, if the UK government choose to radically reform council tax, for example, then that wouldn't really impact on the fiscal framework, because it would then just really be whatever the Scottish Government wanted to do something similar, and there isn't even any flow through Barnett directly from that, unless the UK Government then used that to potentially give less of a grant to local government to do it, and similar with kind of business rates. I mean, I think we've also been here before, we've had variations in terms of land and building transaction tax and stamp duty, but they've always been, I think, on the basis that there's a kind of relatively marginal changes here. The abolition of a tax or a radical reform to that, I think, has an interesting question about what is the equivalent tax that's been devolved, and that's where we've never been in the fiscal framework ever before, where the tax has been devolved now no longer exists. And again, that will all be one of the things that we need to be discussed at the time when it comes down. But I think it's large. It'll just be interesting to see what happens more than anything else.
I mean, I think another example is the pension age winter heating payment and the changes the UK government announced with the clawback through HMRC, which the Scottish government said they'll replicate. But that's obviously quite a big change in terms of how that works in practice, how it goes through the BGA, compared to what was initially appeared to be a relatively simple devolution of one social security payment. But this, you can imagine, over time, the number of these complexities will change and increase through both tax and social security as the UK government, as it is free to do so, wants to change its policy, and in time the Scottish Government will choose what it wants as well.
Will evolve. So currently, and indeed, as someone sort of slightly argue against it, is this tendency for Scotland to align every payment and tax with the UK equivalent. You know, that happened with the winter heating payment. Oh, we must cut it because the UK cut it. That doesn't necessarily follow. And I think what we'll see with these types of reforms is that natural. You know, I can pick out the UK equivalent of the Scottish version they're going to get further and further apart, and we'll stop. Which I say is not necessarily a bad thing. We'll start thinking of the Scottish budget as in its own right, rather than always thinking of it relative to the UK. So that's a change I think is happening, and these reforms will probably accelerate that.
Just looking at one specific that I think the UK government it's beyond the point of briefing, they have consulted on this, and I think it is clearly the direction of travel, not abolishing or replacing, but quite a significant reform around landfill tax. They're looking at just a single rate for that. Have you done any modelling based on the proposals in the UK government consultation in terms of the impact that?
We would technically not do any modelling kind of hypotheticals. We would wait and see what the government would do on that. Clearly, the changes they would make would change the BGA, which would largely be for them to do, and then we would only kind of do modelling of something in Scotland if the Scottish Government instructed us to say that we would like to consider this as a policy, this is our new policy.
And given the relationship between landfill tax and aggregates tax, and recognising that there are private conversations that you have with government, obviously, has the Scottish Government asked you to do any modelling recently around landfill tax and aggregates tax? Because that's something that when we've had ministers in the past, when we had Ivan McKee in, I think, May, June time, the convener and myself were encouraging the Scottish Government to look at the extent to which they would be able to deviate from the English rates for both of those.
Yeah, so we wouldn't disclose any kind of requests we've got for scenarios, etc., until the government kind of, you know, set a policy, and then it would be for them to announce.
Okay, worth a try. Thanks, convener.
Thanks, Ross. Michelle.
Following on the themes actually from Craig Hoy and Ross Greer, you note there you will not model off hypotheticals. And I suppose my question to you is, what assessment are you making as a Scottish Fiscal Commission of the risks of the fiscal framework against the macroeconomic position? I mean, it's not unreasonable to say that, you know, most people would consider that as a minimum that the risk of a UK sovereign debt crisis is at least elevated. And I mean, I went through all your documents specifically searching on risk, and I wonder to what extent you're constrained by you reporting within the fiscal framework exactly the scenario you've set out, you know, UK budget decisions, a flow through, and that limits your ability to look at the big picture, because we can see flow through everywhere. You look at the energy profit levy, the impact that's having on the North Sea and so on. So I just wanted to get your sort of reflections on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And typically where we would do that sort of work would be in our main, our forecast work. So what we've kind of published in August and was largely our evaluation of our, just looking back about how, you know, how well did we do, where the forecast error has been, what's the explanation for that, and then the fiscal update is largely just saying, well, what are the core announcements that have happened over the summer. Typically, what we would do when we do our budget work and the deeper dive, we'd have a much bigger discussion around the economy, much deeper discussion around the kind of overall fiscal context, and that's where we would do much more discussion about the potential risks in there. So back in May, we talked quite a bit about tariffs and talked about, well, what could be the potential risks for the Scottish economy. We did a bit of a work to see whether or not we thought Scotland might be more exposed relative to the rest of the UK on tariffs, and find we actually didn't. It was a joint risk. So that's where it would be more, we'd do a deeper dive into saying, well, this is a broader UK economic context. What are the potential implications for Scotland in that regard? If there's concerns about the UK fiscal position, what that might then mean for Scotland. So we wouldn't comment on the UK fiscal position. We would actually then just say, well, it is a risk. How might that impact upon the next year's Scottish budget?
I think that the process will be, that's for the OBR's business, and we will take what the OBR says as a routine. So you've seen our fiscal sustainability work. We start with the OBR's projection of how the UK finances will be made sustainable. Now, you may argue that's not what was going to happen, but that's sort of logically the process that we take the OBR's take on it, and they do very good work on that sort of area.
Mm-hmm. I know, and I suppose, you're setting out the process as is and where you do what steps, but I suppose my question is really, is that not ultimately quite limiting, given your articulation of the complexity of how policy choices, the UK government, in the face of a really, quite serious macroeconomic position, is it not ultimately becoming increasingly limiting in your ability to prepare Scotland and the Scottish Government for what might be coming ahead?
So I think that I'm quite comfortable that we can take what, as Francis said, OBR and are saying, and make a judgment about what is happening at the UK level for then the context into Scotland. What we wouldn't do is then start making broader comment about the kind of overall performance of the UK economy and etc., and make judgment calls on that. So that's perhaps the constraint, I think, that you're kind of pushing on is we largely take that as given in terms of the outcomes that are there and the risks that are going to emerge from that, and then look at that in terms of a Scottish specific. What does that mean for the fiscal framework? What does that mean for the Scottish budget? But we wouldn't be doing it for, well, what does that mean for the UK budget? We essentially will rely on what others will say, and then we use our judgment on that about what that then means for Scotland. I think the broader point that you're coming to, you're talking about, which if I can come to, is just how intricate the Scottish budget process is with the UK. We've seen it with things like changes to pension age winter heating payments that then have an immediate impact. We see it with the PIP reforms being implemented but then being reversed. We see that with the spending review, the shift to defence, the economic outlook at the UK level having an impact on Scotland. The Scottish budget and the fiscal framework isn't a standalone thing. It's really closely linked to what's happening at the UK level.
Yeah, where we come close to what you're talking about is in our fiscal sustainability work, because we do our projections on the assumption that current Scottish and UK government policies remain constant. But we know the UK government policies are not fiscally sustainable. So we have done some simulations in our fiscal sustainability reports of what happens if the UK government tries to go on a more fiscally sustainable path and what that does to the levels of spending in Scotland. And it dramatically worsens things if the UK government is trying to achieve fiscal sustainability. We don't go into details as to how they're trying to achieve fiscal sustainability. But we are doing the type of exercise that you're talking about there.
Okay. And the reason for me asking about this was I can see that you've done a tremendous amount of work in increasing understanding of the fiscal framework and working very hard in terms of, I love your wee kind of X things on X explaining it and LinkedIn and so on. But I suppose from my reading of it, we now suffer from a depletion of quality financial journalists. In Scotland, they tend to be more generalists. And then faced with an understanding of the fiscal framework and the work you're doing in context, I, in general terms, see quite a lot of gaps in understanding, one of which is not really having any understanding of exactly what we've talked about, how the macroeconomic position of the UK flows through ultimately into the Scottish budget. What's your sense of that, and where's the general understanding? And I'm thinking particularly around media journalists, around the kind of business and economic space.
It's a really good question. It's something the OECD wrote about as well around the engagement, and it has been a real focus of us as a commission over the last few years to get to really improve that level of engagement, improve how we communicate it and do it. And there's certain things in our control, and there's certain things that are reflective of broader challenges within, as you mentioned, within demand, within the media, the loss of kind of financial journalists, economic journalists over the years, which isn't just a challenge for us, but a challenge more broadly. And what we try and do is essentially focus on 3 different elements. So one is who are the people who really need to know the detail. So the committee, and we spend a lot of time engaging with people like the committee, Audit Scotland, other key stakeholders, to make sure that they understand and we understand where they're coming from in terms of the detail. There's then a second group where we engage with, we try and discuss what are some of the more core elements in here, so trying to understand things like trends in social security, things like the tax performance elements and all of that. And then there's the other group, which is how do we try and encourage a more general, better conversation within the society and Scotland at large. And it's challenging. We're a small organisation. We do some really good things, but we depend upon a lot of people demanding and engaging in that. And you're right. Once you then add into a really complex framework into that, it becomes more difficult than not. I said I think we are making good progress on that. We've got good plans around things to do things like induction with new MSPs coming down. We've got a big plan to do much more in terms of how we do our visibility. Our 2 new commissioners that we're looking to recruit, one of the core objectives that we had in terms of our recruitment criteria was the communications and the ability to do that, and again to help us really take that forward. So it's a challenge, but I think there are definitely steps that we can take and have taken to improve it.
Okay, anything to add? Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank you for your contributions. This morning, are there any other further points you want to make to committee before we wind up?
I just want to make one final point. This is Francis and David's last appearance in front of you before they retire as commissioners, and I'll speak on their behalf. I'm sure they'll endorse it. And I'm sure they've greatly valued engagement with the committee, and your kind of critique and discussion of our work has been hugely valued. So, and I just want to add my personal thanks to David and Francis for their work at the Commission over the years.
Thank you, and I fully intended to give my thanks also to David and to Francis for their contributions over so many years. It's quite a sad moment, really, for us, but at least you'll have the joy of the cuckoo clocks that Professor Roy is going to present you with when you get back to the office later on. No, so thank you very much, and I want to wish you well in your continued endeavours in future months and years, and we look forward to seeing the new commissioners in due course. So thank you very much for all your contributions over the years, including, of course, this morning. Thanks to all, and to you, Claire. Thank you. Okay, I'm now going to call a break till 11:05, natural break. I shall begin forthwith. The second part of our public agenda is to take evidence from the Scottish Government on its fiscal sustainability delivery plan and the medium-term financial strategy. I therefore welcome to the meeting Shona Robeson, Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government, who is joined by Scottish Government officials, Jenny Bath, Director of Exchequer Strategy, Richard McCallum, Director of Public Spending, and Lorraine King, Deputy Director of Tax Strategy, Engagement and Performance. I intend to allow up to 2 hours for this session. And before opening up the discussion, I'd like to invite Ms Robeson to make a short opening statement. Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much, Convener, and let me begin by welcoming everyone back after summer recess. Hopefully everyone had the opportunity for rest and reflection. I look forward to engaging with you, not just today, but through the rest of the new parliamentary term. I want to also express my thanks to the Scottish Fiscal Commission for their continued work, including their independent forecasts and the recent fiscal update, which provides valuable context and supports effective scrutiny of our financial planning. This session marks an important moment in our fiscal calendar, and I welcome the opportunity to discuss the Scottish Government's 2025 medium-term financial strategy and the accompanying fiscal sustainability delivery plan. Together, these documents set out how we will manage Scotland's public finances responsibly and sustainably over the next 5 years. Our approach is designed to support delivery of this government's 4 key priorities, and that means making choices that focus spending where it has the greatest impact, supporting inclusive economic growth and ensuring a fair and strategic approach to taxation. The delivery plan sets out the actions we're taking to deliver on these priorities, including how we'll improve efficiency, how we'll reform services and how we'll maximise the value we get from every pound of public spending. We're taking decisive action to close the projected £2.6 billion resource gap and £2.1 billion capital gap by 2029-30. This includes a managed reduction in public sector workforce of 0.5 annually, reforming service delivery and investing in preventative measures to reduce long-term demand. We're also preparing for a multi-year Scottish spending review to accompany the 26-27 budget, which will provide greater certainty and transparency for public bodies and stakeholders and support more impactful spending decisions. On economic growth, we continue to deliver on our national strategy for economic transformation with tangible progress in, for example, broadband connectivity, job creation and investment. Our tax strategy remains focused on fairness and sustainability, with income tax decisions generating £1.7 billion more than if we had followed UK rates. And looking ahead, we'll publish the Scottish Spending Review, the Infrastructure Investment Plan and the Infrastructure Delivery Pipeline alongside the 26-27 budget. And these will provide further clarity on our priorities as a government. I want to emphasise our commitment to working collaboratively with this committee, with Parliament and with stakeholders across Scotland as we develop our approach. Subject to confirmation of the UK autumn budget dates, I hope to be in a position to discuss the proposed publication date for the 26-27 Scottish budget with the committee in the very near future. And finally, while the fiscal challenges ahead remain considerable, the actions we've already taken alongside the upcoming fiscal events later this year give me confidence that we're taking the necessary steps to ensure Scotland's public finances remain resilient and sustainable. Thanks, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that very helpful opening statement. One of the things you said in your statement was you said that spending choices are being made where they have the greatest impact. And in page 59 of the medium-term financial strategy, you say that considerable work has been undertaken since the 2023 MTFS to ensure public finances are focused on delivering the Scottish Government's priorities, underpinned by public sector reform. Actions across the 24-25 and 25-26 programmes for government and associated Scottish budgets have streamlined commitments and prioritised spending while ensuring a balanced budget each year. So given the emphasis on choice and prioritisation, what areas have been deprioritised?
So we have taken an approach that has very much focused on delivery and the areas that the First Minister has set out when he came into office, and gave greater focus for the areas that were to be prioritised through the funding that was available to us. And so in terms of those themes, we have gone through all areas of spend within portfolios and pivoted to those priorities within each portfolio area. A lot of that has required difficult decisions to be made of things that we would not take forward, things that we might have to return to in the future should finances allow for us to be able to focus on the priorities and to make sure that we can fund those priorities. Also, I think it's fair to say that within the Sustainability Delivery Plan as well, there is the opportunity through efficiency and doing things differently, that even with those priorities, to be able to make sure the money goes further. And that's what we've set out, to make sure that every pound that's invested is invested in the most productive way. That work continues. Ivan McKee's leading on that, and I know he's keen to come back to the committee and discuss those plans in more detail. So, just to give you assurance, Convener, that work has gone on in detail across all portfolio areas.
But if there are areas being prioritised, ergo there must be areas that are not being prioritised. Are there any specific areas in any particular portfolios that are no longer being prioritised? Just an example.
Let me give you one example, I guess, and that it was quite contentious, and it was about how far we could go with free school meals, for example. So we have agreed to essentially prioritise those most in need. So linking the further rollout to those in receipt of Scottish Child Payment. That has meant that we're not going to be able to roll out the universal offer to where we had perhaps initially wanted to, because we feel that with the limited resources we have to prioritise those children most in need, and the Scottish Child Payment recipients is a good place, is a good way of doing that, and we know that that will help to help continue to reduce the levels of child poverty. That is one example. There are many others, but I guess it's one where it's a difficult decision to take. We were criticised for it, but I think in the climate where funding is constrained, we have made that decision.
I mean, it'll always be criticised, but the government is obviously to choose. And one area is where the government has chosen to spend a higher proportion of its budget is in welfare. And you've said in page 45 of the report that social security is an investment in the people of Scotland, and that's a number of ministers have been saying that for a number of months. But what would you say is the return on that investment, and what is the opportunity cost of it? In other words, what areas are not able to be funded specifically because of decisions taken to bring in, for example, additional benefits, a two-child cap, which is, understand, will cost £194 million by 2930 if it's abolished in Scotland.
So we've obviously discussed this previously in this committee, where I think I would, first of all, say that I think it is an investment in the cohesion of our society, to invest in the next generation to try and eradicate child poverty. And the fact that we have the only part of the UK with falling child poverty rates tells me that that is an investment that is worth making. So we're investing £649 million in this financial year in the package of 7 benefits and payments only available in Scotland. I was trying to find the figure that the chief economist had released, and I think it was something around. Analysis by the chief economic advisor shows that our additional spending on social security could deliver a £300 million boost to GDP in Scotland's economy in the short term. I guess people spend locally, particularly when they're on fixed incomes and low incomes, and that is an analysis undertaken. Now, we absolutely need to make sure going forward that what we do is sustainable, and that is why the financial sustainability delivery plan sets out the steps that we'll need to take to be able to continue to afford our priorities. So, we see this as an important investment. We need to make sure that we continue to challenge ourselves around the delivery of it, make sure that, for example, Social Security Scotland is delivering in an efficient way, and to make sure that, and there's some work going on with adult disability payment as well, to make sure that we are assuring ourselves of that the processes are correct in terms of the assessments, and happy to share more of that with the committee. But I think the starting point is we believe this is an investment that is not just essential for the future cohesion of our society, but it's an investment that has an economic benefit as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about outcomes and whether or not there's an increase in dependency culture through it. I mean, Social Security assistance is increasing from 6.8 billion to 8.8 billion, so that's 2 billion that's not been spent on other programmes. And my understanding is that local authorities, for example, are having to reduce non-statutory expenditure. So a lot of the things that would work to help reduce poverty, in education, for example, school assistants, community workers, youth workers, campus co-ops, are all having to fall by the wayside. The third sector, we all got, I believe, an email saying that 61% of 240 organisations said they would have to either close or reduce their workforce. One of my very prominent third sector organisations that is, helps people with debt advice, etc., support for rent, advice to help them with alcohol and gambling, is having to reduce its workforce by 40%. So, although money is going into this area of poverty reduction, it can look two-dimensional if you look at, rather compared to the big picture of some other organisations, which, if the money went to them, might actually help people, get into employment, for example, or indeed help them educationally or in other areas with debt and other difficulties. So is that not a concern that by focusing on benefits specifically, there's an issue about which, of course, people need? I mean, we're well aware of that, but it's the additional funding that's gone into that's being effectively not available for other areas.
So there is a fair point of challenge there, and it has to be a mixture. We know from all of the analysis done on child poverty, for example, that there are 3 pillars to tackling child poverty. One is money in people's pockets. The other is the services that people support them, and the third is like support in kind, so things like childcare and wraparound services. So work and employability, the other important pillar. So there's not one solution here, but money in people's pockets does matter, and the driver of lower child poverty rates in Scotland, all the analysis shows that the main driver for that is money in people's pockets through the Scottish Child Payment. Now, there's a lot of important work going on around employability, particularly supporting families. There's a lot of really discrete work going on by third sector organisations that are having really good results.
Well, can I stop you there? They are having good results, but they're also struggling to get additional funding from the government. So, for example, in page 62 of the MTFS, it says employability support provided for almost 72,000 people between April 22 and September 2024. And I mean, I'm a big supporter of employability. I think having a job is the best way to poverty, frankly. And the more people we can get and understand that of those who are economically inactive, more than 100,000 want to actually work. But there's nothing there that says what the success rate of that is, if it's 5%, 10%, 30%, whatever. And what projects work, what don't work, how can we replicate the projects that are successful, discontinue spend on those that are unsuccessful. So I think in terms of fiscal sustainability, you can sometimes get the best of all worlds if you're investing efficiently and effectively in projects that have been proven to deliver. But there are some projects. I've got projects in my area, and when Tom Arthur was Minister, he visited just a few months ago ago. Remarkably successful, but again, there's issues about whether or not the local authority that's the prime funder in that is able to continue to sustain that.
So, work, first of all, let me agree with you, work is the best way out of poverty. And of course, it's really important that we acknowledge that actually there's quite a lot of in-work poverty. So a lot of people are working, and some of the supports that we provide are helping to support that household income. Now, there is a wider debate around the level wages being too low, and whether or not the living wage is set at the right level. And we have the statutory national minimum wage, and then we have the Scottish living wage. But we want to move to a higher wage economy for sure, because I think there are real issues around in-work poverty, as I know we have discussed many times before. In terms of the successes, each programme is analysed for its success rate, and that will be how, when someone goes into a job, how sustained is it, how long do they remain in employment. So that information is available. We can provide that to the committee if that would be helpful. So if you look at, for example, No One Left Behind, approximately 20% of participants are economically inactive at their start date, and then they're tracked the way through to see what the outcomes are and how long people are sustained in employment for. So we can provide that. And I think it would be fair to say that that should be part of the analysis of whether a programme is continued to be funded. We don't want to fund programmes that don't work. Some of those programmes are quite discrete, so there's quite a number who work very intensively with women, for example. The Miss programme is one where there's a lot of intensive support, and they have good outcomes, but it is intensive and they work for a long time with people. Just one thing I should have said right at the start, of course, is that of the funding that goes into social security, we should remember, of course, that 80% comes from the UK government through the block grant. So UK social security spending is also increasing. And the additional investment on top of that is really where the choice is around things like the Scottish Child Payments. So the bulk of it comes through the block grant.
I think we're aware of that. I think it's the 7 additional payments, for example, and etc. I mean, I know 58% of people who are on universal credit do work, so I think your point about low-paid workers is a very well-made one. But obviously, when you're mitigating, UK decisions, whether it's the bedroom tax, whether it's 2-child cap, that's money that's effectively lost to the devolved services, because you can't spend it twice. And I'm just wondering if any work's been done to look at whether the abolition of 2-child cap unilaterally in Scotland what the impact might be, for example, on housing benefit for recipients or council tax relief, whether or not that'll be impacted. Because my understanding is that COS are saying there will be an impact.
So I know that discussions have been going on with UK government to make sure that that we can minimise any knock-on effect to other supports, as we've done previously with the Scottish Child Payment, because what we don't want is for a payment to be made on the one hand but for people to lose on the other. That is not right. So those discussions are ongoing. But you're right about the wider point of mitigation. And I would frankly much prefer that we had the bedroom tax went at source, and then we could deploy discretionary housing payments in a different way, or the 2-child cap was mitigated by the UK government, as we've been calling for, and so on and so forth. We would, and we've been calling for the UK government to take those steps for that reason. I should add, we also, of course, have welcomed the U-turn on the winter fuel payment, and that will have a material impact on the block grant adjustment in a positive way, which we'll have confirmed in the autumn, but it will significantly reduce the 2.6 billion that we set out, because obviously that predated the announcement. So there will be an amendment, obviously, to what the projection, because it was projected to reduce by 440 by 2930, I think it was.
Yeah, it's reductions to disability payments, etc., which have been reversed. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Just one last thing on social security, because it's not all about that, but in terms of the fiscal sustainability delivery plan, you've said on page 10 that Social Security Scotland will continue to pursue initiatives which increase its ability to tackle fraud and error where it does occur, including the recovery of overpayments. Fraud is often carried out by sophisticated and dynamic criminal actors. However, there appeared to be a piece in the Scotsman a few weeks ago which concerned a number of members of the committee, where the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security said that the government would not pursue overpayments and indeed money fraudulently claimed, and the figure of some 36 million was mentioned. And so I have some alarm bells rang. I mean, certainly many of us, I think. And I'm just wondering if you could clarify what the Scottish Government's position is, because that statement, if it indeed is accurate, seems to contradict what's being said in the fiscal sustainability delivery plan.
I'll have to have a look. I'm not aware of that article, convener, but where there's criminality, we would expect issues to be pursued. But I want to be accurate with the committee, so I'll come back on that. But we certainly would expect, particularly if there's organised crime, when we know that vulnerable people are often preyed upon by criminal gangs in this space. So we want to make sure that there is full deterrent on that, but also that there's a pursuance of any recompense. So I will come back as to why in terms of clarification on the article itself.
Thank you very much. Let's switch to something else, which is the capital spending outlook. I mean, it's of great concern to me, and I'm sure others, that we've had inflation in construction materials of 27% since the pandemic, which is quite shocking, coupled with a 4.3% real-term reduction in the UK capital block grant over the period 22-23 to 24-25. Now, clearly, that dramatically reduces the ability of the Scottish Government to invest in infrastructure, whether it's new infrastructure or indeed maintenance or projects ongoing, and leading to a backlog in maintenance across the public sector, and understand that there will be a 1.8% real terms reduction to 2030 as we move on. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us, because we've obviously been waiting with bated breath for a while now, but when we're going to get it in December for the capital pipeline, but I'm just wondering if you can tell us what the implications are for the Scottish budget, etc., and capital investment as we go forward.
So, yeah, I mean, we will be setting out a lot of the material, as I said in my opening statement, around in and around the budget periods. I think it is fair to say that we have been disappointed with the spending review on a number of levels, but the capital position with the block grant growing by 0.3% compared with 1.8% for all UK departments. That means that essentially we will have a declining level of capital available to us, and with the point you were just making around the costs of construction going up, and all of that means that we will have a requirement to prioritise the pipeline that we bring forward. We won't be able to do everything. Now, clearly, we've already made some commitments and priorities around things like housing, affordable housing, and the Housing Secretary will set out a statement later today on that, but it will mean some difficult decisions. We are looking at what options may be available to us with revenue-based finance, for example, to look at how we might use that in an appropriate way to help to fund projects that otherwise will not be funded. So the capital outlook is disappointing. There has been a bit of growth in financial transactions, which is welcome, and we use that for housing and we use it for SNIB, but the overall direction of capital is disappointing, to say the least.
And then you've said that the growth in resources in real terms will be about 0.8% rather than 1.2% for UK departments. So that's a difference of 0.4%, which is obviously very significant, about £200–300 million a year. So just wondering what's the long-term implications on that in terms of the budget.
So the 0.8% a year is lower. I think the average is 1.5 for UK departments, and had the funding for that day-to-day spend grown in line with the UK government overall spending, we would have had, I think it's 1.1 billion more to spend on our priorities over the next 3 years. So that is without a doubt challenging, which is why we've set out what we've set out in terms of the financial sustainability delivery plan, the need for us to reform, the need for us to drive efficiencies, particularly in corporate costs. Incidentally, UK government is doing exactly the same on workforce and corporate costs, but we are very constrained. I know that certainly FPAC has, in your report, you made a very timely point about the constraints of the fiscal framework, and I couldn't agree with it more. And we've now got a new Chief Secretary to the Treasury as of yesterday, and I had a meeting with my Northern Irish and Welsh counterparts, and we're keen to engage quickly, because there are a number of issues in train. So one is a more fundamental review of the fiscal framework, and we've asked for that, and we want to pursue that. But there also could be some short-term changes that could really help. So, for example, if we could borrow for more than just covering the costs of reconciliations, that would help to smooth out where we have particular peaks and troughs. So there are a number of real constraints with the fiscal framework that it is time, and we don't want to wait till 2028, which is the next kind of formal review period. So we are keen to pursue that as early as possible.
Okay, thank you. Now, since you mentioned fiscal framework, I'll ask you a wee bit about the fiscal framework, which I wasn't really going to, because there's millions of other things to ask, and I'm only got another 5 or 6 minutes before I need to let the rest of the gang in. So it's regarding the fiscal framework between Scottish Government and local government. My understanding from speaking to COSLA earlier this year was that they were hoping it would be signed off in February or March this year, and we haven't really heard anything. So I'm just wondering where we are in terms of that fiscal framework.
So, so the fiscal framework with local government has really, in practice, leaving aside the formality of it, in practice, much of it underpinned the discussions with local government in the lead up to the 25-26 budget. So early engagement, no surprises, open book, all of that was really how we conducted the discussions and negotiations around the 25-26 budget, which is maybe why, compared to other years, I think it received a more positive response from local government, and obviously there's a real terms increase to local government funding 2 years in a row, as confirmed by the Accounts Commission. The issue is about the formal adoption of it. So we've where there has been an issue has been around the desire of local government to have a kind of rules-based framework. But that was only one aspect of the discussions. 95% of the rest of it we've agreed on. And I wrote to local government basically asking for them to agree what we do, the 95%, and to kind of codify the elements of the framework so we can go through the same principles in the 26-27 budget. And I think, and I don't want to put words in local government's mouth here, but I think for the thing holding back the formal adoption has been the issue on rules-based funding. Mm-hmm. We don't believe we can agree to that, and I think we've talked about this here before, because there are so many unknown quantities with rules-based. So, for example, it would have been blown out of the water already because of the employer's national insurance contribution. It would not have encompassed something like that. So, would a rule-based formula only apply when it suited, not when it didn't? We talk about a lot of money that was given to local government through the decision to fund a portion of it. So that's one example. There are many others that it sounds good, but in practice it unravels very quickly when you have issues like the ENIX issue. So I hope we can get to a position, and our ask of local government is for them to codify essentially the good stuff, the open book, the early engagement, the way that the budget has been handled, because it's produced a good result. And I just think we could probably just bank that and then try and move on.
Okay, just one other area for me then, and that's you said in page 4 of the fiscal sustainability document that the MTFS sets out a number of significant risks facing the public finances over the medium term, which need to be managed. So you talk about, in one of the 4 that's listed here, is persistent inflation impacting public spending in a number of ways, including on pay, which is exacerbated by a proportionately larger public sector workforce than the rest of the UK. But I mean, surely a lot of that is the responsibility of the Scottish Government, which is itself presided over the increase in the workforce and the fact that people in the public sector in Scotland are paid better than down south, their equivalents down south.
Well, of course, a large reason, well, one of the reasons for the major increase in headcount has been the increase in responsibilities. So the devolution of large areas of welfare, the growth of Social Security Scotland, and there are other areas as well. So it's not been a kind of growth across the board. It's been quite, the big growth has come from areas.
But it's still over 22% of the workforce compared to 17% down south, and salaries are still cumulatively about 1.3 billion higher than the equivalent down south. Yeah. So. You're right, it is a bigger public sector, but of course we have things in public ownership that are not in public ownership down south, ScotRail, other areas. Now, I would argue that's a good thing, but there are major differences in what is under Scottish Water, for example, ScotRail. There are things under public ownership here that are not in England. So there are areas, if you strip all that out, then there's more of a comparison. However, the point being that, yes, we need to address that in a way that prioritises and protects the front line. So similarly to what the UK government is doing, it has been a particular focus on corporate costs and admin costs and savings in that space, and it goes into that in a lot of detail. In terms of pay, so there is a balance of pay and industrial peace. So we set the 9% over 3 years, and with a requirement for anything beyond 3% in year 1 to have multi-year. Now, actually, a lot of the deals that have been secured have been multi-year deals, and I think that's good. Many of them over 2 years rather than 3, which I accept. However, it buys peace for 2 years. In many areas of our frontline services, and I think that's a good thing.
Sticking, I mean, if you look at the UK government, have had to do this as well. They had a pay policy of 2.8%, and the pay review bodies have well in excess of those. So you either accept the pay review body recommendations or you don't. If you don't, you're straight in, I think, to industrial action and difficulty. So there is always a balance, and we have a very tight set of arrangements across government where any pay offers or proposals for pay offers are put through a system to check about contagion, fairness, making sure that there is not that's not going to have a negative effect elsewhere. And some of those have, in the light of inflation not coming down as quickly as was projected, we've also included commitments to reopen discussions on some of those deals should inflation spike beyond where it's predicted to be. And some of that helped to get deals across the line. These things are more of an art than a science, to be honest, Convener, and having been in the room on a number of occasions, it is trying to get to the best place you can get to avoid
I mean, I appreciate that. The document says, that controlling the public sector pay bill through managing pay growth and develop public sector workforce is important, and as is workforce planning. But I mean, we've been averaging 1.6% increase in workforce in the last 5 years. Pay is never really kept within the parameters set for it. And in workforce planning, how can you plan a workforce when you don't have the ability to bring in compulsory redundancy? So you have people, for example, whose skills may no longer be appropriate, and those people might have to be on redeployment. They might not even be redeployed ultimately. And people that you want to keep, you can't keep because you've got to cut the budget, and you end up they end up getting voluntary redundancy when you don't really want them to. So it seems to me that that a lot of what is being set out here is really laudable, but there's no precedence of them actually being deliverable in recent years, or evidence that they will be delivered as we move forward.
So let me be really clear that the 0.5% annual reduction is absolutely got to be delivered and will be delivered. And Ivan McKee, as the Minister leading on this, is looking at, requiring and then looking at the plans of all parts of the public sector. Now, public bodies have a level of independence here, but they are not. They are required to deliver the same targets, and then within that there is a 20% reduction in admin costs, which is going to drive reform, sharing of services, particularly corporate services, and that is moving forward apace. So this isn't a nice to do question mark. If you can get round to it, please do. It's not. It's a requirement to deliver. And within all of that, though, are two things. One is that we want to prioritise the front line, so there will still need to be recruitment in some frontline services, particularly the health service, for example. So it's seeing the reductions in the right places in a managed, proper way. Your point on compulsory redundancies, let me be really clear about that. So, yes, we want to avoid compulsory redundancies, but there is a process by which an organisation, if they have gone through all the steps that are required and looked at every possibility in terms of voluntary severance, redeployment, and they cannot finish the job because there are people who either cannot be redeployed or don't want to take voluntary severance, then as a backstop option, compulsory redundancy is an option. And you'll have seen from some of the coverage at Visit Scotland has been in that place now. They've been working with the unions around that, and when it became obvious that that was the backstop, a lot of people then reapplied to voluntary severance who had otherwise not done. So, it's really important that organisations will understand that that is the last resort. But I think through the tools of voluntary severance, through redeployment, I'm confident that we can meet these targets in a way that avoids compulsory redundancy if it's done in the right way through the work that organisations are required to take.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm going to open out the session. The first to ask questions will be Craig, followed by Michael.
Cabinet Secretary, the convener has identified, I think, a number of the very real risks that run through the fiscal delivery plan, but obviously you are setting significant store on making savings £2 billion and £1 billion through the public service reform targets set out by Ivan McKee on June the 19th. When he made his statement to Parliament, he said that his plan was rooted in realism, and I quote, not in a headline-grabbing way that simply throws out random targets. You'll be aware that we've received, through a Freedom of Information request, a significant body of paperwork relating to the preparations for that announcement. And one of the key elements that stands out for it is that there were significant concerns both amongst the civil service but also amongst your Cabinet colleagues about the ability to achieve that £1 billion. And I just draw your attention to page 3 of a document that we received, which was dated the 22nd of May, from the Directorate for Public Service Reform, where it says at paragraph 17, we have set out that there is not a specific breakdown of the £1 billion target and there is an element of risk in this approach. So was it rooted in realism or is this simply written on the back of a fag packet?
Well, I can assure you it is not written on the back of a fag packet, and anyone who knows Ivan McKee would know it's far from that, and perhaps he is very methodical and very detailed, and that's not always welcomed, but he is, and that's the right approach to take.
Can I just interrupt for a second, Minister, because paragraph 21 there says there are risks to this approach in that setting such a stretch target, and by a stretch target we mean very ambitious target, and cannot at this time fully set out to the Minister where the savings will come from. The key issue for this strategy is ensuring that the Minister is content with the level of risk between what is fairly secure, so hasn't been tied down, and what is assumed to come through the commitments in the strategy. So it is not a clearly set out plan, is it?
Well, look, there's risk with everything. There's risk of getting up in the morning, but if you don't make change and take, and be ambitious, then you're not going to be able to deliver what needs to be delivered. Now, we have already made progress, which gives me confidence that that level of ambition will be delivered. So if I can give you some examples, the programmes that have already been working have saved just over £320 million over a 2-year period to the end of 24-25, with a projected savings of nearly £300 million over the following 2 years. And that is areas focused on the Single Scottish Estate, the National Collaborative for Procurement, commercial value for money, digital programmes, securing cost avoidance and cash releasing savings. So we have a track record. We're not starting from scratch here. A lot of that has been driven by the work Ivan McKee has undertaken, but also his predecessors as well. So, this isn't an option, as I said earlier, of nice to do if you can get round to it. This is a requirement, and each part of the public sector, whether it's the civil service or whether it's public bodies, will have to set out how they're going to contribute and their contribution to this. So, just to reassure you that, on a weekly basis, this is, Ivan is monitoring, the returns are scrutinised and all of that. Now, I'm sure he would be more than happy to come and set some of the detail out around the assurance that he can give around those processes. He's keen to come to the committee to talk about that. But, just to assure you, this has got to happen because the outcomes from it happening mean that we can sustain the investment in our public services, in the front line of our public services.
But I think, Minister, anybody who's run a business will realise that the first 5% of savings are the easiest to achieve. It gets tougher
it gets harder,
as you finally cut in. You've achieved £300 million and you're now proposing £2 billion. Just to look at some of the risks that were identified by your own civil servants, there is it says that there is a risk that by focusing workforce reductions on corporate functions, we reduce the capacity to develop and implement the changes required within functions to deliver savings. So effectively, if you get rid of those people, you're getting rid of the capacity potentially to make the efficiency savings that you desire alongside that.
Yeah, I think though, not to be cheeky, but I think quite often the press releases and your line of inquiry has often been about the admin costs and the corporate costs. So if we all agree that there is space to reduce those, they obviously have to be done in a way that enables transformation to take place. So let me give you one example. We met with the digital team within Scottish Government who are rolling out a lot of excellent work helping their colleagues in loads of parts of the public sector to do things differently using automation, using smart technology in order to save money. It would make no sense to reduce the digital capacity of the Scottish Government in the areas that they are going to be helping to do that. However, it is without doubt the truth that across our public sector, and I've heard the number of public bodies quoted back to me on a regular occurrence, including in this committee, that each of them having an HR department, payroll department, and so on and so forth, I don't think is sustainable in the long run. So we will require a default of assuming that we need to move into shared services space. Some of that can also be frontline shared services, and we want to encourage that as well. But in the corporate costs, there is without doubt the ability to do that. And of course, the Oracle investment that we've made in Scottish Government is enabling onboarding by a whole range of public bodies who can have that service provided without them having to invest in new systems that are up to date. So, there is a lot happening in this space. It is absolutely got to happen, and it is being monitored to within an inch of its life. So and I suggest that you have Ivan McKee here to tell you in great detail the work that he's undertaking, because I think that will give you further assurance.
We'll move on from this in a couple of seconds, but one of the elements, unfortunately, the government's commitment to transparency as such has been redacted, but it says to the Minister, as you will be aware from your bilateral meetings, a number of Cabinet Secretaries have raised considerable concerns. What were those considerable concerns about announcing £1 billion in public sector efficiency savings?
Well, I think each Cabinet Secretary will have a duty to point out within their portfolios where it might be difficult to deliver and change culture, to bring public bodies into a different way of thinking, where we need to make sure that where programmes are being developed and delivered, that that it's not a salami slicing, it's done in an intelligent way that ensures that programmes are able to be delivered. Because the administrative function is is important, but it has to be streamlined and it has to be delivered in a way that's sustainable. Because if we don't, we can't then invest in our public services. So, so they will have quite rightly raised issues that within their portfolio will be challenging to deliver. And that is what you would expect. The outcome of those discussions, though, will be finding a route forward that ensures that any concerns are addressed as far as they can be addressed. Change is difficult.
But wouldn't announcing the £1 billion figure logically be better done after you've had all those discussions and identified where the savings are made? Just to go back to the initial, this is a headline-grabbing announcement which isn't actually rooted in realism, is it? Well,
I was involved in meetings on a daily basis with Ivan McKee and colleagues in the run-up to the publication of the MTFS and the Financial Sustainability Delivery Plan. So those discussions had already been taken forward and had in great detail. They're ongoing, obviously, in terms of the collective responsibility to deliver the savings. Isn't just my job or Ivan's job, it's everybody's job. So those discussions happened in great detail in advance of the plan. But at the end of the day, this is the government's plan, and it is everybody's responsibility to deliver it, and that's what will happen.
Okay, one of the other things that the document reveals is that there is concern amongst officials about the limitations of the data that have come forward from government agencies in respect to their cost base. On that paper, under Context and Issues, it says the rationale for the £1 billion is based on the data commissioned from public bodies last summer, and then applying a 20% reduction against the corporate function costs. The Minister is aware of the limitations of that data, and they go on to say that you therefore simply cannot forecast forward from that. Are you aware of what the limitations of the data that your government holds?
So a lot of this, I don't know whether Richard might want to come in on this point, but a lot of the data has been interrogated to make sure it is up to date and robust, and I think a lot of commissions have gone back out to organisations to check the veracity of the information and to make sure it is accurate. Richard, do you want?
Yeah. I think the specific point would be in relation to the definitions around what's front line and what's back office. And I think that was maybe a point that the committee raised earlier with the SFC. So part of that further interrogation that we've done with public bodies is actually to really make sure, as best as possible, there's consistency in how that's been applied, because clearly the difference in what public bodies' roles that they provide is very different across the public sector. So actually having that kind of consistency of what we genuinely assess as back office and what is front line, that was that additional work that we've done on that.
And is that work completed now? Have you got clarity around that?
Yeah, so we've been back through with public bodies over the course of the summer. Some of these discussions will continue. I mean, clearly one of the key points here is in advance of the spending review, and actually having that set out and clear as portfolio allocations are made at that point. But yeah, that work's largely complete now. There's some follow-ups that we're doing with individual portfolio areas, and as I say, that will be concluded well in advance of the spending review. Thanks.
Thank you. Just in relation to the costs, between now and the end of the decade, obviously, the next 3 years you've set a public pay policy of 9%. The first 2 years in some areas have exceeded 7%. How rigidly would you, obviously we won't be in position, but beyond the election, how rigidly is the government going to be in the remainder of those public pay negotiations? Are you now saying, if it's presently running at 7.4%, that 1.6% is the limit, or are you willing to breach your own public sector pay policy?
So, look, public sector pay and negotiations are, as I said earlier, the art of the possible, and pay policy seeks to provide a guide to negotiators to constrain and set expectations as far as possible. What it can't do, though, is it can't predict, and we actually have no input into this either, the outcomes of pay review bodies. Now, pay review bodies are UK pay review bodies, but they tend to drive pay. Now, there is an issue there about the way pay review bodies are the way they operate, in that we have no way of kind of inputting into them, and we quite often just find out as it's announced what the recommendation is, and it drives pay, because it's then very difficult to say, oh well, we're going to ignore the independent pay review body down south, when that is essentially a driver for pay. And the UK government is in exactly the same position. It is far from ideal. So we need to, I think, look at how that operates in practice. What we've managed to do out of having that kind of 3-year horizon is, we said very clearly that there was going to be no, you couldn't have a single, if it was going to be a single year deal, it couldn't be more than 3%. And that was important, and it drove multi-year deals. So the unions staff side recognised that if they wanted to have a higher first year, it had to be part of a multi-year deal. And that enables, let me just finish this point, that enables two things. One is, as I said earlier, to buy some peace and predictability. The second is it enables space for reform. So it's where you're not then back in the room again negotiating pay. You can actually be looking at some of the reforms about who does what, changes to roles, and all of that. And that's really important in the space that we've just been talking about in terms of reform. So I think the multi-year deals have really, really helped. And, you know, we obviously built in a bit of contingency to help portfolios with their pay deals. But at the end of the day, a judgment has to be applied that the cost of industrial action is on a day-to-day basis really, really expensive and disruptive. So I think where we've got to is actually quite a reasonable place in this round of pay deals. We're not quite out the woods yet, but I think that multi-year landscape has been really, really helpful.
But surely if you set a 9% pay policy and after 2 years you're plus 7%, and inflation's presently running 3% plus and could be higher or lower by the time we get to that third year of negotiation, what you're effectively saying is your negotiation position is nil because you're not willing to countenance strike action, and therefore the public sector unions have got you over a barrel, have they not, for that third year? Well,
we've never said we won't countenance strike action, and you know, we have seen industrial action in local government previously, and it was costly and disruptive. So, well, look, we need to see where inflation lands, firstly. And we have to do this in the context of inflation's predicted, but it's not a science, and we can see the impact of inflation not going down as quickly as was predicted. That has an impact on negotiations straight away. So when we set our pay policy, as the UK government have done, you're setting it with the best information you have at that time, but you can't predict that where inflation is actually going to go. We can only rely on OBR forecasts and so on. But it is, and therefore you have to have some flexibility. I think where we've got to in reality, though, with pay deals is actually better than where we've been previously because of that. In the main 2 year, some 3 year, but in the main 2 year deals, I think that just gives us some space and certainty for the next 2 years that we can then spend the time talking about other things.
Okay. Finally, you've made virtue of the fact that SNP policy is to have a larger public sector than the rest of the UK and for that to be paid better than in England. Would you be willing to look at that pay differential between ourselves and the rest of the UK and shrink that rather than shrinking the amount of money you're spending on public services, which is the logical outcome unless you tackle public sector pay?
Well, I think we should have fair pay, and I think we have in Scotland through reaching deals with our workforces avoided some of the really costly industrial action. If you look at the health service, for example, the costs to the system down south and the impact on patients has been very disruptive indeed. We wanted to avoid that. And, I think where possible, though, we want to link pay to reform. So a lot of the discussions have been around trying to get to a place of being willing to look at roles and responsibilities. Agenda for Change has been a very complex set of negotiations, but it does now, I think, give us the option to look at reform. Some of that has been linked to contracts, to the working week, and so on and so forth. So we need to, I am not setting out with an ambition to have higher rates of pay in Scotland for the next decade on a point of principle, but I do think the investment we've made in public sector pay has managed to avoid a lot of really costly industrial action. but it has to be affordable. And there is a trade-off between pay and headcount, without a doubt. And there is a need for us to manage the size of the public sector to a place where it is affordable in the long run. And that is why we've set out the plans that we've set out, because we need to make changes there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Michael, to be followed by Ross.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I start with the spending review? The Scottish Fiscal Commission have set out the gap of £2.64 billion by 29/30 between the projected income and your expenditure plans. Will the spending review close that gap?
So what we have set out in the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan, a 5-year horizon of closing the 2.6 billion. I should say, as I kind of alluded to earlier on, of course, that figure predated the welfare changes, the very welcome U-turns by UK Government on welfare, which will bring that down by some significant amount, but we can't confirm that until autumn. So I'll probably update the committee in due course about what we're looking at in terms of that. So the 5-year Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan sets out how that will be, and the spending review will have to have synergy with that, obviously, in order to be able to set out the spending envelopes that will be in tandem with that plan. Of course, spending is and the envelopes within that, there will be changes to, for example, the prioritise of frontline services, reductions in cost of admin, but all of that will be within the spending envelopes. So the spending envelopes are not in themselves going to reduce, but it's what you do within that spend in order to keep them, to put them on a sustainable footing, if that makes sense.
That's very useful. So what we'll expect to see then when you publish this is a series of departmental plans about what they will be doing over the 3-year period and what they will stop doing over that 3-year period.
Well, the envelopes will set out essentially the spending priorities and spending plans of this government. Now, what the Scottish Fiscal Commission also said was he would encourage the opposition to do likewise. So if, for example, given we're heading towards an election, that there is views that those are not the correct spending plans and that money should shift, the SFC, I think, seem to be saying quite clearly that that is an opportunity for others to set out different spending plans, and of course that is absolutely right.
Sure. Okay, but for the government's priorities in this, will we see, I suppose I'm kind of trying to examine how much detail we're likely to see in the spending review. It's something I think the committee are interested in, that we have the Fiscal Sustainability Delivery Plan and we've got those headline numbers that are in there, not an awful lot of detail below them. So will we see a list of things that the government will stop doing in that the spending review?
Well, you will see essentially where the priorities are in terms of the envelopes and growth of funding, and we will clearly set out our priorities within that, and we'll do that for resource, and we'll also set out our capital plans in the infrastructure investment pipeline. So all of that will be set out. And we're keen, to give, I guess, as much certainty to stakeholders by, what that multi-year horizon, because as I've said here before, sometimes that is as important as the quantum of having the certainty of funding. So we will set out, as much as we can, and,
Okay.
We're considering the level of detail that will be provided, but we want to provide an appropriate level of detail. I think the only thing I would also add is that we also need to see what might emerge in terms of the autumn budget. So there's, we can set out what we think that is that we are able to set out at that point, but external events can have a very disruptive impact. I don't think there's ever been a UK spending review set of spending plans that has actually ever been delivered to those spending plans. So I would just caveat that what we set out will be based on the information that we have
and events,
at that particular time.
Events will change these decisions over time. I wouldn't expect anything less. I suppose our concern, though, within this is that we want to see some level of detail that we can understand on a policy level. Do you have proposals from your Cabinet Secretaries in front of you now, with about 3 months out from the finalisation of this spending review? The UK spending review took 14 months to complete. I understand you've got a more truncated period from that, and the challenge of some of that. But are you now saying to Cabinet Secretaries, no, I don't agree with you, you have to do less of that, you have to do more of this? Is that the stage you're at, or do you have proposals in front of you?
So we've been working for many months, and particularly over the summer, more intensively around the meetings and discussions we've been having. Some of that is at official level, which you might want to say a little bit more. But I've had direct bilaterals with colleagues around shaping the priorities, both in the resource and capital space. So, yeah, that level of detail is...
And was it a zero-based budgeting approach? Because we talked about that previously, and I believe that's what the UK government undertook.
Well, I mean, there are... So the level of challenge you could equate to, you're not starting from a point of view of, everything's on the table, but there's 1% that might be, everything should be challenged. So if, in some ways, I guess that there is that principle of we have to challenge each other around, because if everything's committed, there's no room for change. So, but there are clearly key priorities that are big spending areas. So if I take health, local government and social security, those are the 3 big spending areas, which constrains everything else into a much smaller spending area. And, in many ways, if you take health, for example, what's going to be really important is the work going on around health and social care reform to make sure that the 21 billion that was allocated 25-26 is about how that is spent in order to reshape and do things differently. I don't think it would be a great surprise that we've got a commitment to maintain health spending and pass on all consequentials. So, there are some certainties within this, which is a big spending area. So I guess it's just to manage expectations that, we're not going to pitch up and, massively, we're not going to reduce the health spending. What it is a question mark is how that money is spent and what it delivers. But Richard, do you want to say a little bit more about process?
Yeah, sure. So just a couple of things. So first, in answer to your question, Mr. Mayor, about the zero-based review. So we are going through every level 4 in every portfolio in terms of areas of spend. So each portfolio have been asked firstly to do their own analysis, and we've done further work from there. Now, some of that happened pre the UK government spending review, so this isn't a kind of a kind of short-term exercise. This is something that really we kicked off when we knew there was going to be a spending review in June. Obviously, that's ramped up since we got the outcome of the UK spending review in June. And we've used the time over the summer to do further kind of interrogation of individual portfolio plans. And as the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, that's also involved ministerial engagement as well in some of those discussions. So that's the approach that we've taken. I think Professor Roy stated earlier, in some ways, a spending review is much about the process and actually having a kind of good work through it. And I suppose I would go further than that and say, yes, the December conclusions, when this is published, are going to be absolutely key. But actually, it'll be beyond that as well, and actually working through the impact of the spending review and taking it on from there, I think will be really key. And if we're in this cycle now of spending reviews every couple of years, I think that will certainly help.
That's great. Thank you for that. The committee, I'm sure, appreciates some the detail that you can provide on that. Can I turn then to the concerns regarding the sustainability of the tax base in Scotland, again shared by the SFC in this committee? We want to see good, well-paying jobs in Scotland. You'll have noticed, Cabinet Secretary, the announcement from the UK Government over the weekend of the £10 billion deal struck with Norway to deliver frigates, securing thousands of jobs in the Clyde for years to come. I've not seen a response from the government on that. Is that something that the government welcomes?
Absolutely. Investment in defence in Scotland of that nature, absolutely securing jobs, well-paid jobs, is of course really crucial. And I think we all view the importance of national security and as being absolutely key, particularly in an uncertain world. So, absolutely.
That's good to hear. The context of that obviously is around the rise of Putin, the war in mainland Europe, and the threat in the North Sea around that. So, do you recognise that you think it's right that the proportion of UK spending on defence increases?
Well, we would want more spending on defence in Scotland because, if you look at GERS, for example, there was a disconnect between what was attributed to spending on defence in Scotland compared to the actual spending on defence. So anything that can remedy that by actually having investment in defence industries here in Scotland is to be welcomed. I mean, we would have some caveats to that because the example you've used is an example of ships that are absolutely needed for defence purposes. There are some areas of defence that we would be less keen on, obviously spend on nuclear weapons being one. But in terms of that type of conventional defence...
On munitions, because the government's position at the moment seems to be that you support the boats, but you don't support the munitions that go with them. Is that the case?
We're not a pacifist government at all, and we believe that we should have spending on defence in the right areas, securing Scottish jobs. There are concerns around any defence companies who may, for example, have interests in weapons that find their way into areas that we would presumably not be too happy about and are concerned. And I'm thinking about the position in Gaza at this moment in time. So there are areas to be differentiated here, but the example you used of Norwegian vessels, is where we would want to see the growth in defence.
So you're keen to see an increased proportion of UK spending going towards defence in order to meet these aims. Is that a yes?
Well, I think we already said that we recognised at the time, we recognised that there would need to be an increase in defence spending on the right things. Okay. Our contention is some of it is not on the right things. So you could swap out the huge eye-watering spend and projected spend on nuclear weapons, and you could spend that on defence forces. So there's a question about what happens within defence spending rather than taking money from welfare into defence spending.
So in your response to the comprehensive spending review, you said that real-term growth of 0.8% a year for the overall block grant, which is below the average for UK departments. Is your contention then that the entirety, how do you square those two things, I suppose is my question. How do you think that the overall proportion to go on defence should grow, but you should maintain the proportion for non-defence related areas?
Well, the point I was making was that the average increase for UK departments, that is across all departments. Scotland was much less at 0.8%, also compared to Wales, for example, because it depends on the configuration of where spending departments have gone up or down.
I agree with that, but if you want an above average increase in defence, how can that you then make the argument that you want to see the same average increase on devolved capacity? Like, do you want it to grow faster than spending, or do you not?
Well, but a lot of the defence expenditure was in the capital spending, not on the resource spending. Yeah. I'm talking about day-to-day resource spending, which is where the 0.8% of UK departments compared to 1.5. I'm talking about resource spending, not capital. Okay. And most of the defence expenditure was in the capital space. So it's the day-to-day spending that matters here. And we have come off very poorly because of where the reserved devolved areas. And
you would recognise that at a Treasury level, though, the government has to make decisions where it spends the entirety of its budget.
Well, yeah, you've just been asking me about our spending choices, of course.
But these are comments that you've made about the comprehensive spending review, Cabinet Secretary. So it's about the entirety. I don't feel like
we got a good deal out of the comprehensive spending review, either on resource with the 0.8%, or on capital 0.3%, even compared to other devolved nations. Okay. And there is an opportunity cost there of, on resource, £1.1 billion that we could otherwise have had by those small margins of difference matter to the budget. And that brings us back to some of the difficult decisions, because that would mean 1.1 billion less we would have to find in the sustainability plan, and it would make the spending review a lot easier. So this is just about I think it's about the fiscal framework actually, and FPAC themselves, including yourself, have produced a report which I think puts some real questions about the limitations of the fiscal framework and the constraints of it. And I think that is an area that we could probably all agree on.
I think that's fair. On your response to GERS, you claimed that only 2.1% was actually spent with industry in Scotland in 23-24 on defence. But would you recognise that 75% of defence spending goes on personnel, for which there are over 14,000 people in Scotland, which is not included in the figure that you used?
Well, the point I was making was, and it's not just in defence, there are other areas as well, is that the notional figures that are attributed to spend in Scotland don't always accord to the actual spend on the ground in Scotland. So those two things don't equate, and that was the point I was making, that you have a notional allocation and then you have the reality on the ground, and there is a mismatch there.
But you're not including the 14,000 people who are employed in Scotland within that 2.1 billion. That's about money attributed to industry rather than the global figure on defence, isn't it?
I think it was including if you could locate, but of course that then is a difficulty as well, because personnel are located all over the world, and trying to extrapolate what is the Scottish spend is quite difficult. But there was such a mismatch of, I think, £2 billion, if I remember rightly, that can't be reconciled. So there is a mismatch, and I think we could talk about GERS all day. I think our contention is that it's a notional element doesn't bear a relationship to the actual spend, not just on defence.
I suppose my contention within this is just about how you are representing your support for increased defence spending, whereas at the same time opposing it in a variety of different ways on the basis that you're claiming that you're being shortchanged on the basis of public spending, when actually this money is being attributed not just to personnel in Scotland, but overall, that the budget has to rise at a proportion faster than the rest of the expenditure. Well, I don't really understand the government's position. It can't claim that both of those things are consistent at the same time.
Well, the point I was making on the spending review was that on day-to-day resource spend, most of the defence spending is on capital, so it's not part of the resource spending, that our increase in resource spending is significantly less than the average of UK departments, which has a direct impact on our day-to-day spend of 1.1 billion. And commentators that I've heard who are by no means supporters of the Scottish Government or the SNP have confirmed that that mismatch of average increase in spend has an absolute direct impact on our budget.
Okay.
So, I'm afraid we can, leaving aside the defence issue, that is the fact. And,
okay. I'm going to close on an issue directly related to revenue spend. Since 2019, when the government declared a public health emergency around drugs deaths, over 6,000 people have died in Scotland. That's still, as announced today, the highest rate in Europe. An absolutely appalling record. In the budget for 2024, in 24, you gave a real terms cut to alcohol and drug partnerships. Is that something that you think is going to be reversed in the forthcoming budget? Is it a decision that you regret? And do you think, when we're talking about a spending review, setting plans for the coming years, is there going to be anything in that spending review that can set out a plan that deals with this horrific national record?
Well, first of all, I think it's of concern to everybody, and not least that I represent a city that has a huge issue of concern with drug deaths. And a lot, of course, though, has been done in this space. We have the National Drugs Strategy backed up by, I think it was £100 million of additional funding. We have a lot of practice now that is really important in terms of things like the investigation of near misses, the rollout of naloxone. So I think over the last 5 years there has been a real improvement in the intelligence in this area of public health, and the rolling out of practice that has been shown to work. Is there more to be done? There certainly is, and although there has been a reduction in drug deaths in the statistics this morning, as I understand it, I haven't seen them, but as I understand it, there is still a long way to go to make sure that we can move on from what you've described.
But is this the kind of policy change that you want to see driven through the spending review? Going back to the questions that have changed, if we don't want to have the worst drugs deaths record in Europe, despite having the same drugs laws as the rest of the UK, a much, much higher proportion of drug deaths. But is this something that you're going to tackle in that spending review? Is it something that you're going to say is a priority and that you want to see change when you're having those conversations? So, for instance, is there a proposal on the table that you've had in the conversations Mr McCallum has had and others with departments to say, we think this is a massive problem, it needs to change, and this is what we're going to do about it?
Well, we need to have the right policies, and there's not one single policy here. There is a mix of policies, and I think the areas that I've described are the areas that are having an impact, things like the drug consumption room as well, and the practice, the making sure people can be seen quickly when they ask for help, the MATS standards, all of that. So there's not one solution, but the things that have an evidence base of working then need to be properly funded, and that is why there's been an increase in funding. Now, if there is a requirement for an increase in funding to do more in that space, then of course that will be a key priority for the government. But it is about what is done and how the money is spent on effective interventions. And I think all I'm saying is I think those effective interventions are in a better place than they maybe were a few years ago in having an evidence base. Now, if there are suggestions, Michael, of things that we're not doing at the moment that you're saying would work, I'm very happy to hear them, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary for Health would be willing to hear them as well. But I think we know where the effective interventions are. We need to make sure they're happening everywhere, that people can get assistance when they ask for it, and that we tackle some of the wider poverty issues in and around addiction that we know drive addiction, not just in drugs but in alcohol as well. So, I am all for having that discussion. If you want to follow up with some suggestions and discuss that in a very constructive space, I am all for that.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Ross, to follow by Liz.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. Good afternoon, Cabinet Secretary. You said, it was either in your opening remarks, I think, in one of your initial answers to the Convener, the government's goal is that every pound is invested in the most productive way. I struggle with that, though, because of examples that I've raised with you before, most obviously the small business bonus scheme. So if we accept the premise that it is appropriate to spend in the region of £250 million giving support to small businesses in the form of tax relief, the government commissioned an independent review of that particular scheme 3 years ago, and the Fraser of Allender Institute could find no evidence of positive economic outcomes from it. Is that spending £250 million in the most productive way?
Well, first of all, congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
So, look, we should keep things under review, and we should challenge ourselves and be challenged on areas of spend. I mean, small business bonus scheme, and we have discussed this on a number of occasions, serves a number of purposes of, well, first of all, keeping businesses alive that may not otherwise be so, but also many of them are located in our high streets and our town centres, which have, there are challenges there as well. So, that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at how effective it is. Is it, if there were changes to the scheme, could it be more effective? I am a supporter, though, of supporting small businesses, and I think they are the bedrock of our economy, and they've been through a tough time and are going through a tough time with the current environment that they're operating in. And
with respect, Cabinet Secretary, though, I totally accept that premise. I agree with you on the importance of small businesses. My point here is that the government commissioned an independent review that quite clearly concluded if you want to spend £250 million supporting small businesses and supporting the Scottish economy, this is not the way to do it. Like, the review was quite unequivocal. It found no evidence of positive economic outcomes. And the small business bonus scheme hasn't changed since then. It was, for an unrelated reason, it was tapered somewhat, so the number of businesses who've accessed it has gone down slightly. But the point was the government commissioned an independent review, which is exactly what it should have done. It then didn't change anything on the basis of that review. So I'm struggling to see here a government that is determined to follow the evidence and get best value for public money. I'm not challenging the premise of spending £250 million supporting small businesses, but do you not accept that there is a better way to do it, and the government needs to take a more robust approach? Because it did the first half of the process, which was commission an independent review, didn't do the second half, which is change the scheme to be more effective as a result.
Well, I am always open and open-minded to looking at how we make improvements to any of the schemes and systems that we have in place. And we also need to watch that we don't create, we've talked about creating dependency earlier on in the sphere of welfare. We need to watch that whatever programmes that we have, that businesses need to be viable, and we want to support businesses that are viable and providing much needed services and presence in many communities. And but we keep things under review, and if there are ways of ensuring that we can support more businesses or support businesses in a more effective way, then we should be open-minded to doing that. It is very difficult, though, in the current climate where businesses are struggling, to begin to say to them, "Oh, we're going to take away your support, or we're going to take away your rates relief." I don't think that would be the right thing to do in the current climate, because the economic climate is very, very difficult, particularly for small businesses. So, we'll continue to have these discussions, but I think it would be about improvements to the system, but very much supporting the principle of supporting small businesses. But if there are ideas of how we can make it better, then happy to discuss those further.
I'm glad for that, and it's a discussion for another time, but one we've had before. For example, I don't think it's appropriate that shooting estates owned by some of the wealthiest people in the world get the small business bonus scheme when there are many genuine small businesses in Scotland who require more support.
Small number.
A few £1 million, but a few £1 million that would be better spent elsewhere, I would suggest. Moving on to another area. High levels of inequality are harmful to public finances because they are harmful to the economy at large. Normal people spend their money in the economy, generates tax revenue, has a net positive effect. The very wealthiest people in society tend to be less productive with their wealth. A lot of it is offshored or it's holed up in assets that are not used productively, etc. You published stats last week showing that the richest 2% of households in Scotland have more wealth than the bottom 50% combined. Is that, in the Scottish Government's view, an unacceptable level of wealth inequality?
Well, we have recognised the issue of wealth inequalities for as long as I can remember, and have been very clear on principles that, you know, those with broadest shoulders and should be able to, should contribute more. The difficulty has been around our powers to be able to, if we're heading in the direction in this exchange around wealth taxes, for example. I am in favour of wealth taxes, but they're very difficult to deliver. And if you look around Europe, many have tried, not many have succeeded. And I think just recently it was the Norwegians who had to rein back. So in principle, yes, but it's the how and the delivery of that. I do believe that large assets that should be recognised in terms of the contribution that people make, but finding mechanisms to do so is the hard bit. There's early days of work from the Scottish Land Commission around the land valuation and all of that. You'll be aware of that work. So it's not that we're not interested in looking at these areas, but there's then a lot of process issues. You know that to be able to move forward with any additional area of taxation requires huge negotiations with the UK government and then a whole process to go through, even on the presumption that they are in agreement in principle. And there's a lot of this space where I'm not sure there would be an agreement in principle. We might see something appear at the autumn budget that might surprise us, who knows. But, you know, so there's a difference between, you know, principle and practice and being able to do something that would work and that would bring in resources anytime soon. So I think it's just pragmatic that we've you know, that you could spend a lot of money pursuing something in this area, but it would produce no funding anytime soon, and I'm quite thoughtful about that.
And I appreciate that. A wealth tax proposal wasn't where I was specifically heading, though I agree with everything you said about that, both in the support for it in principle, but also the practical challenges of implementing it. From your answer, though, what I'm taking is the Scottish Government is not satisfied with current levels of wealth equality or wealth inequality in Scotland. No. There are levers entirely within devolved competencies. Most obviously, on your point around taxation of wealth, the council tax, that's our most immediate form of wealth taxation. The single largest form of wealth in Scotland, it's not the majority of wealth, the single largest form of wealth is property wealth, residential property. The failure to reform council tax is, in my view, the single biggest failure of the devolution era. And taking on board what you said around the other pieces of work that are underway around land taxation, for example, what I'm looking for here is to get a sense of whether the Scottish Government has a plan to reduce wealth inequality. Is it looking at all the levers that are available to it and which ones could be used to reduce wealth inequality in a way that is good for public finances and good for the economy at large by redistributing more of that money to those who will actually go out and use it?
Well, I think in practice, through our taxation system, we do require those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more, and that has helped us fund things like the Scottish Child Payment. So, you know, we have taken steps to try to reduce inequalities, and we have the only part of the UK where child poverty is falling. So, you know, I think that, for me, that is a track record we should be proud of. In terms of...
was proud to vote for all those budgets, proud that my party collaborated with yours on it, and we have made significant progress compared to the rest of the UK. But the point is, all the efforts we've made so far have got us to this point, where the top 2% own more than the bottom 50%. So clearly there's a need to go further. And what I'm looking for here is to get a sense of what the Scottish Government thinks those next steps are.
Well, as I said earlier on, there is not an obvious clear path around powers over some of those areas that would be the more straightforward options. Now, whether the UK Government may or may not look at that remains to be seen. We'll get a flavour of that soon at the autumn budget. On council tax, look, I have spoken about this on a number of occasions, and I am up for looking at reform, but it can only be done in a way where there's some degree of consensus. And, the last time there was any kind of idea of kind of moving forward with reform, you got the usual kind of political response from, with all due respect, from the opposition. And, if we can only move forward with it if we can find an area of agreement. And in the absence of that, it is very, very difficult to embark on a programme, particularly when we don't have a majority in this place. I think we should return to a serious discussion post-election on where there may be areas for reform. It will be interesting to see where the UK Government go with some of the very complicated interrelationship between property tax reform and council tax. I'm still trying to get my head around what that means. It sounds incredibly complex, which probably means it may never happen. But anyway, we need to have an honest kind of discussion. I think that's probably going to be a post-election one, though.
I appreciate that at this point in the parliamentary timetable. I would say I think the government needs to be brave enough to accept that the only way council tax reform will move forward is with a majority and not unanimity. I don't see the prospect for unanimity, and the government needs to recognise that there is a potential majority for some kind of reform, at the very minimum for revaluation, but only if the government forms part of that majority. There are other MSPs. My group is certainly willing to play a part in that majority. Well, it's not going to be unanimity. I do think there are areas, though, for broader consensus around reforms to the existing system. It is more difficult when you get into a wholesale replacement to the council tax. That's where it gets difficult to find areas of consensus. But we're interested in looking at where UK Government go, and we'll, I think, as I say, a post-election discussion to see if there's any common ground, enough common ground. And since I'm putting all my greatest hits, I've got one more, and it was teed up by what you were just saying about the response of opposition parties anytime something is put forward. I have every sympathy with the government's position at budget time when opposition parties demand increased spending but won't say where the money will come from. You've heard me say before that I think the highest quality budget debate we've ever had in this place was 2017-18, where the government invited all parties to put forward tax proposals and have them costed by the SFC. Given that there's only one budget left before the next election, will the government take that same approach and invite opposition parties to publish our own proposals so that all 5 parties can have those proposals scrutinised and, critically, that they can all be costed by the SFC and, at that point, scrutinised by Parliament?
Well, I think that's a very interesting idea. I'll take that away. I don't know whether the Finance Committee might have a view of that as well. I think the Scottish Fiscal Commission have gone quite far in suggesting that the spending review, for example, is an area where if others have a different approach to spending plans, then they should set that out, particularly in a pre-election period. And I think you've got an eminent organisation like the SFC saying that perhaps will put a little bit of pressure on opposition parties to set out alternative spending plans. And if they don't, then I think that would be quite revealing. Anyway.
I agree.
Thank you. Liz, before by John.
Thank you. Can I concentrate on the sustainability of the social security budget? At the start of the session, the convener flagged up your own statistics that say that the social security payments budget is going from £6.8 billion in 25-26 up to £8.8 billion in 29-30. So that's nearly a 30% increase in 4 years. Could I ask you, Cabinet Secretary, given that you say that the Scottish Child Payment has been an effective delivery of social security payments, what work is the Scottish Government doing on other aspects of the social security budget in terms of its effectiveness? And can I particularly ask about the adult disability payments, which are ballooning out of control?
So let me just repeat something, though, that I said earlier on, because I think it merits repeating. And that is, I guess, the context to this, where, yes, you're right, the Scottish Government anticipates spending around £8.8 billion on social security assistance by 2029-30. But of that £8.8 billion, over 80% comes from the UK Government through the block grant. So there is an issue. I'm not saying it's not an issue, but there's an issue. UK Government spending on social security is increasing, and therefore 80% of it is essentially through the block grant. Now that leaves choices in terms of what we do around investment on top of that, and also what we do around policy choices within that. So you've referenced ADP and PIP. Now let me say a couple of things about that. One is, we all signed up to, I think it was unanimous, that we wanted a social security system that was based on the principles of dignity, fairness and respect. So the emphasis was always that our social security system should look and feel different from the system, the UK system. Because of concerns about the stigmatisation and all of that. So that's what everybody signed up to. So it's no surprise, therefore, that Social Security Scotland you take those principles through to decision-making and the way people are supported. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that we should be making sure that our systems are as robust as they can be, and we had a bit of a discussion earlier on around recovery of overpayments, and particularly where there's been criminality. And we also, they should be delivered as efficiently as possible. So some of the efficiency drives will apply to Social Security Scotland and the work that they do as well. And we, I know that the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice is looking at, the processes for reviews of ADP awards to make sure that where people's circumstances have changed, for example, that might impact on eligibility. Now, one thing, because I know you've raised this before around the 2% of ADP awards ending or reducing when compared to, I think it's 16% for PIP. But just let me say one thing about that, because there's been a bit of work trying to get underneath that, and I think it's important to share this. So over the last 5 years, nearly 40% of PIP review decisions where they end or reduce the award are then changed following challenge. So that means that over the last 5 years, the 14% of PIP awards initially reduced or ended at review could be closer to maybe around 9% once final decisions following challenge are reached. Now, there's still a difference, but I think it's important just to recognise that getting it right first time is not a bad thing either.
But, sorry. Thank you for your detailed answer. I mean, the key point, Cabinet Secretary, is that the economic forecasters, not least of which is the Scottish Fiscal Commissioner, are warning very strongly about the difficulties for fiscal sustainability of the social security budget, because it's increasing at a faster rate than it is in other parts of the United Kingdom. And it's whether the evidence that the Scottish Government has about the effectiveness of the policy making is enough to ensure that these are the right policies. Now, in the Scottish Child Payment, there is evidence to suggest that it is. But when it comes to the adult disability payments and some of the other disability payments, there seems to be a lack of evidence. And it's all very well to talk about a more beneficent system that's based on fairness, etc. We did all sign up to that, but we also signed up to a welfare system that delivered for those most in need. And at the moment, we seem to be increasing the social security benefits at quite a rate. And one questions whether all of that money is going to those most in need, and worse still, not having the unintended consequence that we're actually stopping some people going back into the labour market. And it's that question that I think concerns us all from a fiscal sustainability angle, but I'd be interested to know what work the Scottish Government is doing to try to address that very serious concern.
Well, it's important that we always apply rigour to all of the systems that we have, and that we should always challenge and make sure that our systems are fit for purpose. And I think that the fact that we have made a very conscious decision, I guess, to invest in the social security system to support people who and remember, adult disability payment is a benefit that is and a support that is paid for people who essentially have been determined not to be able to work. Now, where there is an importance, I think, is making sure that upstream we are helping and supporting people before they fall out of work and before they end up in a position of going towards adult disability payment, because we know that with the right support earlier on, people can be kept in work and supported in work. And I think there is an issue of too many people ending up falling out of work through health conditions that then eventually require them, leave them unable to work. So there is something about upstream. I think, though, and I'm just going to be blunt about this, we sometimes talk around these issues, but nobody ever comes forward and says we should cut ADP or we should...
That's where I think the whole issue of universality comes into, and I think we should be talking about these, in fact, I have done many times. Can I just finish, because I'm conscious of time? When it comes to the incentives about ensuring that there are more people going back into the workforce so that we raise the tax revenue, we're obviously becoming more economically productive. Are you not concerned as a government that the system that we have of welfare, which is, it's less penetrating in terms of the questions that are asked of people, and no face-to-face inquiries as there are down south, are you not concerned that as a result of that, we're encouraging more people to stay on benefits rather than going back into work?
So I think we need to make sure that, and it goes back to the point I've just made, that first of all, work is absolutely the best route out of poverty, and we all agree on that. So how do we ensure that there are routes for people who have been out of the workplace for whatever reason to go back into the workplace? And that comes back to what we talked about earlier about our employability schemes, what works, where's the evidence base. And without doubt, some of them are very effective, particularly in the space of women who have maybe been out of the labour market for quite some time, having kids, etc., etc. But there's more work to be done in that space, I think, absolutely. And then there's the point about avoiding people falling out of work in the first place, because we know that the longer someone is off work, the less chance they are of going back into work. And I don't think we're as good there as we could be, if I'm honest. Okay. I think we could do more in that space.
Okay, thank you. And John.
Thank you, Convener. We've covered quite a lot of ground already. I mean, we talked about the £2.6 billion potential gap, but perhaps more urgently for 27-28, there's an £851 million forecast negative reconciliation. That would be over our borrowing limit. Have you any thoughts on that and how we're going to address that?
So, first of all, let me say that the good news is that the reconciliation for 26-27 is a positive £406 million. So let's start with the good news. And I actually think that shows how things can change, because there's been a big change in that number. And thinking back to, and I'm trying to remember the year, and Jenny might help me, where there was a predicted big negative tax reconciliation that then completely changed. Was it 22?
Went from 701 to something much smaller.
Yes. So there is volatility in this space. But we have to plan for, any worst case scenario. So we are in discussions, and it comes back to the fiscal framework lack of flexibility. So first of all, I think the limit is something that we are wanting to discuss and have been discussing, and then there's the flexibility over borrowing powers more generally. So we will be monitoring this very, very carefully, and working with Treasury around the borrowing limit for a worst case scenario. However, I do think, given the level of volatility, that figure will change. And I suspect it will change, hopefully in a positive direction. But we're going to work with the Treasury around contingency.
Well, I certainly share your hope that it will reduce. I did discuss this with the Scottish Fiscal Commission in the previous session, and just this whole argument, and you've already said that you've asked for a review of the fiscal framework. But I think this kind of emphasises it again, that as the Scottish budget has increased, the 700 million reserve or the 600 odd million borrowing limit have not increased proportionally. And I mean, that concerns me quite a lot. And it's all very well increasing them by inflation, but I mean, our responsibilities have increased by a lot more than inflation.
Exactly. We've made that point very powerfully, just to reassure you. And we will continue to make that point. We want to try and make progress with some short-term flexibilities. There is a wider issue of the fiscal framework per se. We need to agree the scope of another review, more fundamental review. But there are also some shorter-term flexibilities that can make a big difference, like the use of reserve, like the borrowing limits, like the borrowing flexibilities. It could be, all of these could make a real change. But, just on the fiscal framework, the income tax net position can change due to, well, not just differences in tax policies, but the composition of the tax bases in Scotland and UK. I think this is a point that your own committee have recognised, that, it's no area of the UK can, are all skewed by a comparison with London and the South East. So if every part of the UK's budget was set on the basis of, that comparison, then it would be, it would be very challenging but because of the fiscal framework applying in the devolved context, it absolutely skews the funding base. So we have to address that, and I think we've seen enough years now of what it means and how it works in practice to know where the weaknesses of it are. So I think the time is right for a more fundamental review. And we're
certainly agree. I mean, do you get any positive vibes from the?
Well, we've got a new CST, as of yesterday. So I'm a little concerned that we've talked all these things through now, and we've got. The good thing is, at official level, we've got a really good working relationship of understanding the detail, and there's a lot of discussion which should remain the same because the officials provide that continuity. But I am writing to the new CST with obviously welcome to your job letter, but behind that also just setting out a little bit of where we've got to, because I don't want to go back to starting blocks on these issues. And I know that Welsh and Northern Irish will be doing the same. We want to try and bank progress made and start the discussion from there rather than back at first base.
Okay, thanks so much. I wanted to ask around a little about capital expenditure, and you mentioned we are currently exploring the use of revenue finance models. I just wondered if you could expand on what that means.
Yeah, so, well, one good example, I'm not sure if this is in the public domain about granting yet. Is it in the public domain?
I think it's
is it? It's now. So one area where we're agreeing with Edinburgh City Council is around obviously the grant and funding landscape, and the component parts are quite complex and funded from various bits. But there was a final bit that of the jigsaw that needed to be completed, and in order for it to be completed requires Edinburgh City Council to borrow, and we have agreed to pay the revenue costs for that borrowing. So that's one example of actually quite a pragmatic way of completing. Now that works for big projects where it's about housing, it's about transport infrastructure, but I actually quite like it. I think it's a good way of making sure there's not one bit that's...
And the only cost then would really be the interest cost on that, because I mean, immediately I saw that I was getting a bit worried about PFI, PPP,
right.
and
So let me
reassure
on. We've learned lessons of the kind of, but we have obviously brought forward Hubco, we've done NPD, and we are exploring things like the mutual investment model that the Welsh have used, but they're a million miles away from the terrible deal that the public sector got out of PFI previously. We're also quite interested in understanding where the UK government are going with revenue-based finances, because it's got to make, it's obviously got to pass the value for money test, so it has to, and in the current financial climate with interest rates, not ideal. So I'm a bit of a pragmatist, so if we can make something work that will deliver projects that otherwise wouldn't be delivered, that's the kind of space I'm in. Okay. But they've got to meet the value for money test, and they've got to be good value for the public purse. But so these things we're working through some of these issues in relation to.
And are you still committed to the limit that was put in place, I think, by John Swinney a while ago, about how much of the Scottish budget should go to repaying capital or interest payments?
Yeah, we've got our rules of. Do you want to, Richard? My brain just gone to mush 300.
Yeah, so we're still using those same basis for those rules, and we'll apply that. I suppose the other thing just to say is for the particularly on the revenue financing, the 10-year infrastructure strategy that I think has been mentioned and that CAPSEC will set out later this year. I think we'll have more on the options around both public capital but also private financing options as well. So we'll set out more then.
Okay. And financial transaction money, now I think that particularly when it was cut back, it particularly hit the housing budget, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Where are we on that now? It's improved a little bit.
Yeah, it has improved. It's projected, I had that earlier on because I was looking at it and I can't find it. It's projected to go from, I think it was 163 to 300. Have you got the figure there? I will have, but it's annoying because I had it. So there is an increase in financial transactions. So we will be looking at the use of those primarily for SNIB and housing, and we welcome any increase in the FTs. There is, though, a bit of opaqueness around where there is a bulk of FT funding being routed through things like the National Wealth Fund. We are not clear about the governance arrangements for that. So, we want the National Wealth Fund to invest in Scotland, but it's a little bit opaque around, well, how are the decisions made? How do they align with the priorities we've set out, the priorities that local government have set out. It's just not where it needs to be, because, you know, at the end of the day, it's collective funding. Sorry, 167 to 360 FTs. You know, I think we get better bang for our bucks if we align funding in a way that is clearly aligned to joint and shared priorities. We don't want to go back to the days of, you know, roundabouts in somewhere with a UK government badge on, because, you know, because that's what used to happen. You know, that's not a good use of money. We need to invest big strategic capital investment in joint shared priorities to make the best use of our collective resources.
And housing would fall into that category?
Well, UK government are routing their funding through Homes England, I think. It's a different setup. We obviously route funding through local government and through RSLs. So it's a bit different, and they obviously borrow as well. So the funding we put in is then enhanced by the borrowing that they undertake. So it's a bit of a different model. I'm talking more about big infrastructure projects. So the National Wealth Fund is supposed to be you know, funding for catalysts for a lot of big like big projects that are industrial or net zero. But there's not a clear governance around how are those decisions made. So, and I just think there's scope to do better in that space. We're not the only ones saying it. The Welsh and Northern Irish are saying the same.
That's great, thanks. And I noticed that in the medium-term financial strategy, you talk about contingent liabilities, and you specifically say, for the first time, we're also presenting information on this. Now, the committee has raised questions before about the cumulative effect of contingent liabilities. So I was just interested that it was in here, and I wondered if that meant there is a bit of concern on the part of government that this is getting quite big now, these contingent liabilities. Normally we talk about them secretly in the committee, but obviously they're out in the public domain here.
Will we come back on that? I'm just
I mean, I think part of it was to respond to the committee's particular asks on that, which was why we included. But yeah, we could provide more detail as well. I don't think
there's anything too alarming, but Jane.
No, sorry, I was going to add. I think it was absolutely just recognising that contingent liabilities are a relevant issue to bring through in the medium-term financial strategy, and to refer to the improved governance framework that's been put in place, which includes the Finance Committee.
I don't think alarm bells should be ringing.
No, well, that's good. Fine. I think I shall leave it at that. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. I think that concludes questions from the committee. It's been a long shift. I just wonder if there's any further points you would like to make.
I don't think so. There's one or two things we said would come back. We've got a note of, so we'll do that.
I mean, I could have asked more questions, but I mean, you know, we've all got lives outside this committee, and I think we need to start living them. Okay, well, thank you very much for your evidence today. It's really very much appreciated. That concludes the public part of our meeting. Our next item on agenda, which we'll discuss in private, is consideration of our work programmes. I'll just give a 1-minute break to allow our witnesses, official report and broadcasting to leave.